Chapter 451. What is going on? Mo Jingqi demanded angrily. A young man kneeling at the front of the group said in a loud voice, "Since the founding of Great Chu, the Su clan has served Great Chu loyally, and the ancestors of Su clan have taught and educated the people, and have done their best to cultivate talents for Great Chu. May I ask your majesty, what crime did the Su family commit to have their entire family confiscated?" Mo Jingqi choked, the anger in his heart growing. The Su family plotted rebellion, and their crimes are punishable by death. As citizens of Dechu State, you actually dare to plead for mercy for these traitors? Another person in the crowd raised his head. Where is the evidence of the Su family's rebellion? Please instruct us, your majesty. Hearing this, the people kneeling at the palace gates all shouted, "Please instruct us, your majesty." Their meaning was clear. If the emperor could really produce evidence of the Su family's rebellion, then they would have nothing to say. What evidence did Mo Jingqi have? Even at the start, he did not accuse the Su family of rebellion. However, after the disturbance caused by these scholars, Mo Jingqi's anger soared. How could he care about anything else? He could only pin the most serious crime on the Su family. Furthermore, if the Su family was said to have colluded with Prince Ding, the Prince Ding mansion's reputation among the people was not inferior to the Su family's. When the time came, there would only be trouble. Impudent! All of you, quickly retreat. We will forgive your sins. Mo Jingqi said. The Su family is innocent, your majesty, please judge clearly. These people dared to beg for mercy at the palace gates. How could they be dismissed with just a few words from Mo Jingqi? The palace gates were in an uproar. Even many commoners had heard the news and came over, surrounding the palace gates so tightly that not even a drop of water could trickle through. As a result, it was even harder to take action. Your Majesty! What crime did the Su family commit? Does your Majesty want to confiscate the Su family? Just as they were making a ruckus, a loud voice suddenly rang out, and the crowd parted to make a path. The white-haired old Duke Hua led a group of people and walked forward in a grandiose manner. Mo Jingqi's face was as black as ink. He stared at the majestic old Duke Hua, cursing in his heart. Duke Hua stepped forward, lifted the hem of his robes, and knelt on the ground. The Su family is loyal and righteous, and Mr. Qingyun's name has spread far and wide. What crime has Su Shi committed to make your majesty so angry? Would your majesty please explain? Following behind him were some of the top officials in the court. There were even some members of the imperial clan and some old ministers of the former emperor who had been idle at home. They were all people who had a good relationship with Mr. Qingyun and the Su family. They all echoed in unison, wanting the emperor to give them a clear answer. Mo Jingqi angrily attacked. The Su family rebelled. Duke Hua, are you going to protect these traitors? Duke Hua raised his head and said in a clear voice, "If Lady Su is truly plotting rebellion, this old man is willing to be a pawn and personally take away the lock, allowing the emperor to punish me. But your majesty, may I ask where is the evidence?" Mo Jingqi said, "The Su family is the maternal grandfather of Mo Xiuyao's wife, Yi Li. Mo Xiuyao is currently occupying the northwest and is clearly going against the court. Could it be that the Su family shouldn't be seized?" Duke Hua did not back down at all, saying in a clear voice, "Whether Prince Ding is going against the court is still unknown. Everyone can clearly see that the Su family has never had close relations with the Prince Ding mansion, nor have they said a single good word for Prince Ding. Just because of Prince Ding, your majesty wants to seize the Su family who has not nurtured countless talents for the Dechu state. It is truly difficult to convince the public. Duke Hua, you're impudent." Mo Jingqi's chest heaved up and down. He pointed at Duke Hua, unable to speak for a long time. Noble consort Lu, who was standing to the side, hurriedly reached out to support him. Mo Jingqi took a few deep breaths and was about to speak. Suddenly, the sharp voice of an eunuch came from the palace gates. "The Empress Dowager has arrived. The Empress has arrived." Before he had time to look back, a loud voice came from the other end of the street. "Great Elder Princess Fu Shi has arrived. Great Elder Princess Xiaoyang has arrived." As if God didn't think Mo Jingqi was busy enough, when he saw the carriages of Great Elder Princess Fu Shi and Great Elder Princess Xiaoyang coming slowly, the sound of horse hooves came from another street. The suspect was Prince Li, Mo Jingli, who had not returned to the capital for a long time. Mo Jingli flew off the horse and walked quickly to the gate of the palace with his men. He actually arrived earlier than Great Elder Princess. Greetings, royal brother. Greetings, royal mother. After saluting, Mo Jingli stood up and said with a smile, "Why is it so lively at the gate of the palace? What are royal brother, royal mother, royal sister-in-law and so many people doing?" Mo Jingqi looked gloomily at Mo Jingli, who was obviously in high spirits. Although he had to reconcile with his younger brother for many reasons, it didn't mean that Mo Jingqi had really forgotten Mo Jingli's rebellious behavior. Even now, his good younger brother was still involved in a large area south of the Yunlan River. Ignoring Mo Jingli, Mo Jingqi could only look at the Empress Dowager, the Empress, and Great Elder Princess Fu Shi and Great Elder Princess Xiaoyang, who had just got off the carriage and walked to the gate of the palace. He said lightly, "Royal Mother, Empress, why are you here?" Before the Empress Dowager spoke, the Empress came to the front, knelt on the ground, and said in a low voice, "The Su family of Yunzhou is loyal to the Dechu state. Your Majesty, please reconsider." There were several concubines beside the Empress. Although they were not favored, they were virtuous women from scholarly families. They also knelt down and said in unison, "Your Majesty, please reconsider." Mo Jingqi's face darkened. Before he said anything, Great Elder Princess Fu Shi and Great Elder Princess Xiaoyang had come to the front. Great Elder Princess pushed away the palace maid who was supporting her, knelt down beside the Empress, and said, "What crime did the Su family commit? Your Majesty, why do you want to confiscate the Su family? Your Majesty, please tell us." Great Elder Princess Xiaoyang didn't say anything, but directly knelt beside Great Elder Princess. It was obvious that what Great Elder Princess said was what she wanted to say. You. Mo Jingqi was almost trembling with anger. But Great Elder Princess Fu Shi was a senior, so he couldn't let her kneel at the gate of the palace. He hurriedly asked the palace maid beside him to help her up, and said, "Your Majesty, let's go back to the palace and talk about it." Why did you come back to the capital city?" Great Elder Princess didn't appreciate his kindness, and said lightly, "I'm old and useless, so I don't dare to expect your Majesty to listen to the advice of old people like us. But the Su family has really made great contributions to the Dechu state. Not to mention that they didn't do anything wrong. Even if they did, your Majesty should punish them lightly. Although I'm old and muddle-headed, I still want to beg your Majesty. Please investigate the Su family clearly." Great Elder Princess's words made Mo Jingqi so angry that he almost fainted, but he was still speechless. Looking at the increasing number of scholars, officials, and even ordinary people gathering in front of the palace gate, Mo Jingqi only felt that he was going to faint, and he was afraid that today's matter would be difficult to be settled. Mo Jingli, who was standing beside him, was in a surprisingly good mood. At that time, he took the risk of rebelling. Although he only lived in most of the regions south of the Yangtze River temporarily, he was much better than before. It was said that Mo Jingli was the younger brother of the current emperor, who was doted on and respected by the emperor. But with his emperor brother's temperament, how could he really give him power? In the capital city, he was just a little better looking than other princes. But now, he occupied the prosperous regions south of the Yangtze River. Even if his emperor brother was furious, he couldn't do anything to him. Speaking of which, Mo Xiaoyao did him a big favor. If it weren't for the fact that Mo Xiaoyao now occupied the northwest and made his emperor brother extremely afraid, he couldn't return to the capital city so openly. At this time, seeing Mo Jingqi's angry face, Mo Jingli didn't show it on his face, but he was very happy in his heart. Chapter 452. Royal Grand Aunt, Xiaoyang Aunt, Royal Sister-in-law, what are you doing? You should get up quickly. Royal Brother is wise and will definitely give justice to the Su family. Stepping forward, Mo Jingli respectfully advised. But it would have been better if he didn't advise. His advice reminded Mo Jingqi that not only were the scholars and officials in Jing, even his grandaunt, aunt, and empress were against him. Thinking of this, blood rushed to his head. Mo Jingqi roared, "Su Shi is guilty of treason and should be executed. Pass down Jin's decree, Su Shi's entire family will be executed." Hearing this, there was an uproar in front of the palace gates. Standing on the side, Mo Jingli's lips secretly hooked into a cold smile. The people kneeling wanted to say more, but Mo Jingqi was already fuming with anger. He rushed to say, "Whoever dares to ask for mercy will be punished the same as Su Shi." Everyone was stunned. Suddenly, an old man in the crowd stood up and loudly said, "Emperor, Su Shi is innocent. Emperor, please investigate." Mo Jingqi's eyes slightly narrowed and shot out a cold light. He naturally recognized this old man. He was the former imperial censor who had already retired. In the past, Mo Jingqi hated this old man who always told him that he shouldn't do this or that. So before Mo Jingqi ascended the throne, he was the imperial censor. Until he retired 3 years ago, he had never been promoted. "You really are daring. Do you treat Jin's decree as wind passing through your ears?" The old man said with tears in his eyes, "This old official doesn't dare. This old official is willing to use his old life to ask the emperor to take back his decree." After saying this, he slammed his head into the palace wall without a care. The palace walls were made of the best marble. When the old man slammed his head into the wall, the white marble was instantly dyed red with blood. The old man collapsed at the bottom of the palace wall. It was clear that he was no longer breathing. This old official who had already retired was using his death to ask the emperor to take back his decree. "Your Majesty, Qinxie asks Your Majesty to take back the order." The empress stood up and looked deeply at the man in front of her who was in a rage. Ever since he ascended the throne, he had been very wary of the meritorious deeds of the old officials of the previous dynasty. Naturally, he was also very wary of the empress who came from a meritorious family. No matter what she said, he always doubted her intentions, and never listened to half a word of her advice. In the beginning, she only remembered her father's and the previous emperor's instructions and wanted to be a virtuous empress who could persuade the emperor. Gradually, her heart turned cold. However, no matter how cold-hearted he was, he still had to persuade her today. If the emperor really did confiscate the Su family, he was afraid that the Dechu state would really fall into chaos. Mo Jingqi was stunned for a moment before an idea flashed through his mind. He shouted, "Stop the empress!" Everyone was stunned, but they saw that the empress did not move at all. She just stood there and looked at the emperor helplessly. The empress sighed faintly in her heart. Did the emperor think that she was also going to die to persuade him? As the empress, she was also the emperor's wife. How could she let the emperor bear the crime of forcing his wife and the empress to death? Mo Jingqi stared at the empress in a daze, and his face turned pale. On the other side, Great Elder Princess was not so polite. She said coldly, "Since Your Majesty said so, please lock me up as well. I am willing to share the same crime as Su." With Great Elder Princess taking the lead, the people behind also shouted, "We are willing to share the same crime as Su." In an attic not far from the palace gate, the half-closed window could see the scene at the palace gate in the distance, but the people outside could not see the people inside. The noise outside the palace gate naturally spread into the attic. By the window, Leng Haoyu held a wine cup and leaned against the window lazily to drink. The man sitting opposite him was dressed in white, handsome and elegant. His eyebrows were slightly raised, and only bloomed with a pure lotus-like elegance, like an immortal. Who else could it be but Su Qingchen? When Su Qingchen knew that Yi Li had returned safely and was pregnant, he knew that there would be an accident in the future, and the Su family could not easily get out of it. Therefore, he rushed to Yunzhou as soon as possible after dealing with the affairs in the south. After returning to Yunzhou, he had a deep talk with his grandfather and father, and then rushed to the capital. He happened to see such a good show. Leng Haoyu looked at young Master Qingchen, and there was a little more appreciation in his eyes. In Leng Haoyu's opinion, among the 5 young masters of the Su family, only young Master Qingchen was the most similar to the princess. Usually, he was amiable and gentle to others, but when it was time to fight, he was fierce and never soft-hearted. In such a situation, what do you think Mo Jingqi will do? Leng Haoyu was a martial artist, and his eyesight was naturally better than ordinary people. He clearly saw Mo Jingqi's expression and face outside the palace gate. Su Qingchen on the opposite side only held a cup of tea, looked leisurely and calm, and said with a faint smile, Mo Jingqi is cruel and merciless, but he lacks courage. No matter who set up the trap today, he can't solve it. If he killed a few people in the beginning, the people behind him would naturally stop. If he didn't hesitate to kill Mo Jingli, how could Prince Li have the power today? 10 years ago, if he didn't hesitate to kill Prince Ding, how could there be today's situation? With such a temperament, even in peaceful times, he can't be called a monarch, let alone now that chaos is coming. He can only be played in the hands of others. Leng Haoyu's heart was slightly cold, and he looked at the handsome man in front of him in awe. Young Master Qingchen's talent was well known in the world, and he was famous for being extraordinary, but he didn't expect to say such sarcastic and sharp words. Nodding in agreement with Su Qingchen's point of view, Leng Haoyu turned his gaze to the city gate again. His eyes lit up, and he said with a smile, "The good show is coming." The palace gate was in a deadlock when a clear and steady voice came from not far away, "This subject, Su Hongyan, greets the emperor." Everyone turned their heads and saw that Su Hongyan wasn't wearing his official robe, but a white cloth robe as he strode over. 2 steps behind him was Su Qingbai, who was also dressed in cloth robes. Seeing him, many people called out, "Lord Su is here." Although Su Hongyan's reputation wasn't as good as his father and brothers, he was still a famous talent in Dechu State. It was just that he was trapped in the capital when he was young, and he was an imperial censor without any real power. Naturally, he wasn't as good as his father and brother who taught students in Yunzhou. Su Hongyan walked to the palace gate and bowed respectfully to Mo Jingqi and the others, saying, "This subject, Su Hongyan, greets the emperor, empress dowager and empress dowager." Su Qingbai followed behind and bowed. The Sunshine eldest princess frowned and said, "Lord Su, why are you here?" Su Hongyan smiled faintly and said, reporting to the princess, "Because of the Su family's matter, how could this subject not know about it? I've troubled the princess and everyone to plead leniency for the Su family, Hongyan has written here. Also, elderly." Looking at the old man's corpse at the foot of the palace wall, Su Hongyan let out a long sigh, the corners of his eyes red. He bowed deeply to the old man's corpse and said, "The Su family has received Elder Li's great kindness, and there's nothing we can do to repay it." After doing this, Su Hongyan turned to the people kneeling behind him and said, "Many thanks to everyone for pleading on behalf of the Su family, but this is the Su family's family matter, and we shouldn't implicate everyone because of the Su family's mistake. Please return. Su Hongyan is here, respectfully awaiting your majesty's decree." Su Qingbai, who was kneeling beside him, also said, "The Su family's 4th son, Su Qingbai, is here." Chapter 453. Mo Jingqi sneered, stared at them and said, "So, you two plead guilty?" Su Qingbai smiled faintly and said, "If the emperor wants me to die, I should die. His Majesty wants to exterminate the Su family. How dare the Su family not respect him? But what crime do you want us to plead guilty to, Your Majesty?" Su Qingbai and Su Hongyan's behavior left a better impression on the people present, and at the same time, they were more dissatisfied with the emperor. Mo Jingqi obviously felt that the ministers and relatives kneeling on the ground were dissatisfied with him. If he didn't act like this, something bad might happen today. He closed his eyes, suppressed the anger in his heart, and said, "Send Su Hongyan and Su Qingbai back to the censor's mansion. Without my order, no one is allowed to see them." After that, he turned around and walked into the palace gate, ignoring the reactions of the crowd. Mo Jingqi seemed to leave in anger, but in fact, he had suffered a lot these days. In addition, he was very angry today. If he didn't leave now, he might not be able to hold on. Prime Minister Liu, who was standing aside, waved his hand and asked people to take Su Hongyan and Su Qingbai back to the censor's mansion. Although the Su family was not exterminated today, it was inevitable that the Su family would fall out with the imperial court, and the Lu family would become the first aristocratic family in the Chu state soon. Su Hongyan and Su Qingbai thanked the people kneeling on the ground again before they were taken away. The people in front of the palace gate also dispersed. Seeing this scene, Mo Jingli smiled thoughtfully and followed the Empress Dowager into the palace. Zhaoyang Princess looked at the palace gate that gradually quieted down and sighed helplessly. She looked at Great Elder Princess beside her and said, "Imperial Aunt." Great Elder Princess shook her head, and her old face looked a little tired. She held Zhaoyang Princess's hand and said, "His Majesty is confused." "Well, Zhaoyang, stay with me for a few days." Zhaoyang Princess said with a smile, "There are few people in Zhaoyang Mansion. I'm glad that you don't mind." She helped Zhaoyang Princess into the carriage, and then the two carriages went out of the city one after another. Leng Haoyu, who was sitting upstairs and watching the show, chuckled and said, "Young Master Qingchen is wise. Lord Su leaving like this is much better than leaving directly before." Not only did this strike a blow to Mo Jingqi, it also didn't damage the Su family's reputation. Now, it was the royal family who had let down the Su family, not the Su family who had let down the royal family. Su Qingchen stood up and glanced at the empty palace gate. She smiled faintly and said, "I just need to put on one more show and I can leave the capital." Leng Haoyu said, "How did young Master Qingchen know that Mo Jingqi would make a move? What if he doesn't make a move? Do we have to put on a show ourselves?" Su Qingchen lowered his head and sipped his tea. He smiled and said, "There's no need. Even if Mo Jingqi doesn't make a move, someone else will." On the other hand, Mo Jingqi naturally flew into a rage when he returned to the palace. In front of everyone in the palace, he mercilessly reprimanded the concubines who had knelt and begged with the empress. Just as he was about to banish them to the cold palace, he heard the empress step forward and say, "Today's matter was started by Qinxie. If your majesty wants to punish Qinxie, then punish Qinxie as well." Mo Jingqi was angry. He had always been on guard against this empress and didn't dote on her. However, she was still the wife bestowed to him by his imperial father. Before he ascended the throne, they had supported each other for a period of time. Therefore, he had always given her enough respect. Hearing the empress say this, Mo Jingqi sneered and said, "You still know that you are Jin's empress? You want to embarrass Jin in front of all the people in the capital?" The empress lowered her eyes and calmly said, "The Su family can't be compared to other families. They are closely related to the Chu state. If the Su family really has the intention to rebel, Qinxie won't dare to object to any of your majesty's decisions. But your majesty, does the Su family have such intentions?" Mo Jingqi choked. Facing the empress' calm and bright eyes, he couldn't say anything. After a long time, he angrily waved his hand and said, "Everyone else, scram. As for the empress, stay in your palace and don't come out. Leave the matters of the inner palace to concubine Lu." The empress didn't object. She stood and said, "Many thanks to your majesty. Qinxie will leave. My sisters, come with I." The concubines naturally wanted this. Today, they had volunteered to follow the empress to ask for the Su family's life. Just now, the empress had saved them, so they were even more grateful to the empress. They weren't favored in the palace to begin with, so they naturally didn't have any expectations for the emperor. Watching the empress leave with her people, Mo Jingqi waved his hand and smashed an antique porcelain on the table to pieces. An eunuch reported from outside the door, "Reporting to your majesty, Li Wang requests an audience." "Tell him to scram." Mo Jingqi angrily roared. Concubine Lu stood beside him and coldly looked at his mad appearance. A trace of disdain flashed through her eyes. 3 days after the incident at the palace gates, late at night, the imperial censor's mansion suddenly caught on fire. Then, there was the sound of fighting. By the time the guards of the yamen and people in the inner city who had a good relationship with the Su family arrived, the entire imperial censor's mansion was already in ruins. When people rushed into the imperial censor's mansion, they only found 1 or 2 servants who were lucky enough to survive. The rest of the people had turned into charred corpses that had been burned by the fire. It was impossible to tell who was the Su family and who was the assassins. However, someone at the scene accidentally stepped on half of a burnt palace guard's token. Although the imperial censor's mansion was quickly taken over by people sent by the palace and all the unrelated people were driven out, some news still secretly spread. The entire capital fell into an even more strange and dignified atmosphere. 20 li outside of the capital city, on a secluded and deserted path. Leng Haoyu cupped his hands and smiled. Lord Su, young master Qingchen, 4th young master, take care of yourselves. 2 simple and inconspicuous carriages stopped by the side of the road. Su Qingchen sat in the carriage and said to Leng Haoyu with a faint smile, "This time, I've troubled young master Leng. Take care." Leng Haoyu smiled and said, "It's my duty to work for the prince. There will be Shadow Guard and Qi Lin secretly protecting you all along the way. You don't have to worry about your safety. As for the servants of the Imperial Censor's mansion, I'll also make arrangements. Please rest assured, Lord Su." Su Hongyan nodded and said, "Thank you for your trouble, young Master Leng. I'll take my leave now. Everyone, take care." Leng Haoyu nodded with a smile and stepped aside. The carriage slowly moved forward. In the carriage behind sat Madame Su. However, beside Madame Su was not her original maid, but the young miss of the Qin family, Qin Zheng. Like Madame Su, Qin Zheng was only wearing ordinary cotton clothes, but she was already beautiful and moving. However, she grabbed the corner of Madame Su's clothes with one hand. Obviously, she was a little uneasy about leaving home for the first time. Madame Su patted the back of her hand lovingly and said with a smile, "Zheng, it's been hard on you. In the future, Auntie will definitely let Zhe hold a grand wedding for you." Qin Zheng's pretty face was slightly red and she whispered, "Since Zheng is engaged to the 2nd young master, how can I feel wronged?" Madame Su saw this and became more and more affectionate. She smiled lovingly and said, "Good child, if that child Qingzhe dares to bully you, mother will definitely stand up for you." Auntie, at the beginning of September, the Imperial Censor's mansion was attacked by assassins and the entire mansion turned into a sea of fire. 10 days later, the young miss of the Qin family, Qin Zheng, who was engaged to the 2nd young master of the Su family since childhood, fell ill and died in less than half a month. Chapter 454. Although Mo Jingqi had forcefully suppressed the discussion of the murder case in the Su manor, how could such a thing be suppressed? Within a few days, the news that the emperor had sent people to assassinate the Su family and set it on fire had spread throughout the capital and the Dechu state. At the same time, Master Qingyun announced at Lishan Academy that because the emperor had killed the Su family for no reason, the Su family would move to the northwest to seek refuge. Lishan Academy would continue to open in the northwest. The students who did not move to the northwest could choose to study at other schools in Dechu state. Those who wished to continue studying at Lishan Academy could also study in the northwest. By the time the imperial court sent people to Yunzhou, the entire Yunzhou Su family had already left, leaving only an empty academy on Lishan Academy. When Mo Jingqi received the news, he was furious. He ordered people to set fire to Lishan Academy and announced to the world that the Su family had colluded with Prince Ding to rebel. He ordered all the prefectures in the northwest to arrest them. However, the Su family was protected by the shadow guard that Mo Xiaoyao had specially sent to protect them. They did not enter the city at all. The various government offices were intimidated by Prince Ding's power and did not dare to make things difficult for the Su family. Unexpectedly, the Su family safely left Feihong Pass and headed to Ruyang. At the city gates of Ruyang, Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao stood hand in hand outside the city gates. They looked at the carriages that were gradually approaching and revealed happy smiles. "They're here." Although they had been waiting for the news from the shadow guard, they were still worried when they did not see them arrive safely in Ruyang. At this moment, when she saw the fleet, Yi Li felt that her heart, which had been hanging in the air for the past few days, was finally at ease. Mo Xiaoyao looked at her with a smile. I told you it was fine, but you were so worried that you almost scared Feng San, Qin Feng, and the others. If the people below saw that Princess Ding, who would not change her expression even if Mount Tai collapsed, was still so worried, who knows how many people would be scared. Yi Li also smiled a little embarrassedly. She was flustered because it had nothing to do with her. How could she not be worried when she thought that this matter concerned the entire Su family? Before the carriage reached the city gates, Yi Li let go of Mo Xiaoyao and went forward to welcome them. The one driving the carriage at the front was the shadow guard of the Prince Ding mansion. Seeing the people approaching, he immediately stopped the carriage and turned his head to say, "The prince and Wang Fei have come to welcome Mr. Qingyun." The door of the first carriage opened, and Su Hongyu came out first. Together with the shadow guard who was driving the carriage, they helped a white-haired old man out of the carriage. Yi Li stood in front of the carriage and looked at the familiar yet strange old man in front of her. She only felt her eyes redden and tears unconsciously fell. The old man in front of him looked thin and distant. He had a head of white hair, but he didn't look old at all. Instead, his eyes were full of spirit. Seeing Yi Li standing in front of the carriage, the old man showed a hint of nostalgia and affection on his face. He seemed even more amiable and otherworldly, like a celestial being. Li. Mo Xiaoyao walked forward and saw Yi Li staring dazedly at Mr. Qingyun with tears in her eyes. His heart ached slightly. He smiled helplessly and said, "Mr. Qingyun has arrived. Why are you crying?" Yi Li found that her face was covered in tears. Long before her mother had passed away, her maternal grandfather had returned to Yunzhou. In between, Yi Li had recovered the memories of her previous life. She appeared to have not seen her maternal grandfather for many years. Now that she suddenly saw him, the scene of her maternal grandfather holding her on his knees as he read to her as a child flooded her mind. She actually unconsciously cried. Maternal grandfather. Yi Li greets maternal grandfather. When Yi Li knelt, Mo Xiaoyao didn't hesitate. He lifted his clothes and knelt on the ground with Yi Li. Mr. Qingyun hurriedly pulled the two up and said, "Prince, you can't do this." Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and said, "Mr. Qingyun is Li Li's maternal grandfather. Naturally, I should pay my respects." Mr. Qingyun looked at Mo Xiaoyao's young head of white hair that was even whiter than his 70-year-old self. He couldn't help but sigh. He looked at Yi Li and smiled with gratification. "Good child, after not seeing you for so many years, maternal grandfather almost thought that he would never see you again. It is a blessing that we can meet again in this life. Why are you crying?" Yi Li hurriedly wiped away her tears and said with a smile, "Li forgot herself. Maternal grandfather and uncles are all here. How can I cry when our family is reunited? Maternal grandfather, uncles, and aunts have suffered along the way." In the carriage behind them, Su Qingchen supported eldest Madame Su. Qin Zheng supported second Madame Su as they walked down. Behind them was Su Hongyan. Su Qingbai couldn't help but smile when they saw this scene. Before he could say anything, a cheer came from the city gate. Su Qingyan had already rushed out like a gust of wind. Before he arrived, his voice had already reached them. "Grandfather, father, mother, you're finally here. Your son missed you so much." Humph. Seeing his youngest son's jubilant face, Su Hongyu lightly snorted. Su Qingyan immediately became listless. He pitifully leaned against Su Qingbai and softly called out, "Fourth brother." Su Qingbai wordlessly reached out and patted his head. Su Qingyan glanced at his father who was still staring at him and hid behind Su Qingbai even more. Seeing him like this, Su Hongyu became angry. He narrowed his eyes and opened his mouth to scold him. Sir Qingyun looked at his youngest grandson who saw his father like a mouse seeing a cat and said with a smile, "Forget it. If there's anything, we'll talk about it later." Su Hongyu naturally wouldn't go against his father's wishes. He respectfully nodded and said, "Father is right. Li greets eldest aunt and second aunt." Yi Li then stepped forward to greet the two Su madams. She also smiled and greeted Su Qingchen and the others. Eldest brother, third brother, sister Zheng Er. Seeing Qin Zheng's arrival, Yi Li was even happier. She turned back to look at Su Qingfeng and Su Qingze who were walking quickly behind her. Eldest Madame Su took Yi Li and looked her up and down. She smiled and said, "When we left the capital, Li Er was still a little girl. Now you have a child of your own. In the blink of an eye, so many years have passed." Yi Li smiled faintly and said, "Indeed, so many years have passed. My two aunts must be tired from the journey. Let's go back to the city and rest first." Knowing that Sir Qingyun liked peace and quiet, Mo Xiaoyao and Qinjing didn't arrange for many people to come and greet them. Only the two of them brought Su Qingfeng and the others to greet them at the city gate. When the group returned to the Prince Ding mansion, Steward Mo led everyone to greet them. The mansion had already prepared the courtyard and toiletries. They were only waiting for everyone to freshen up and rest. In the evening, they would invite the officials and generals of Ruyang City to welcome the Su family. Su Qingbai smiled at Yi Li and said, "Li Biaomei, there's no need to rush. We're all anxious to see our little nephew." Yi Li smiled and turned back to order Qing Luan, "Quickly go and ask the wet nurse to bring the baby over." Qing Luan left with a smile. Yi Li personally helped Sir Qingyun to sit at the head seat and personally served tea. Everyone took their seats. Su Qingze and the other two bowed to their grandfather and parents again. Sir Qingyun looked at his children and grandchildren and the smile on his face became more affectionate. Although they had left Yunzhou where the Su family had lived for several generations, it was still a very happy thing to be able to reunite with the family. Looking at Su Qingfeng, he smiled and said, "Fenger, I haven't seen you for several years. You look a lot more spirited." Compared to the other four young masters of the Su family, Su Qingfeng was considered an anomaly in the Su family. It wasn't that he didn't know how to read, but he didn't love those things that were insignificant. The Su family wouldn't look down on their children and grandchildren, but they weren't that comfortable. Now, it seemed that Su Qingfeng was showing off his ability and was bursting with heroism. Seeing his grandson like this, Sir Qingyun was very pleased. Chapter 455. Su Qingfeng smiled and said, "Grandfather is right. Grandson has learned a lot in Sister Li Er's army. This is all thanks to Sister Li Er." Everyone looked at Yi Li in surprise. Yi Li quickly waved her hand and smiled, "This is all third brother's own ability. I didn't help much." This was the truth. After throwing Su Qingfeng into Qilin, Yi Li didn't ask any more questions. This wasn't only because she wanted to give Qingfeng absolute trust and power. It was also for Su Qingfeng's own good. In a place like Qilin, if one still had to rely on connections, then it was better not to go. Otherwise, one wouldn't even know how one died. Fortunately, Su Qingfeng also had a stubborn temper. Compared to the other elites of the Mahist army, Su Qingfeng, who came from a normal army camp, didn't have an advantage. However, he gritted his teeth and persevered without a word. Even Qingfeng praised him. "We were shocked when we heard that Li Er led the army to beat back the hundreds of thousands of Xiling's soldiers. It seems that our Su family is going to have a female general." Second Madame Ao was more familiar with Yi Li and didn't have any scruples when she joked. Yi Li smiled helplessly and said, "Second aunt, you're also teasing Li Er. How am I a general?" Mo Xiaoyao looked at Yi Li with a smile and said, "Li Er is indeed not a general. However, Li Er is more powerful than a general." Hearing this, everyone laughed again. "Little Shitzi is here." Mother Lin walked in with the baby in her arms. It was rare that the baby was still awake. Yi Li stood up and carried the baby. Seeing the baby's white and tender face, she was very happy. Turning around, he carried the baby to Master Qingyun and said with a smile, "Grandfather, look at the baby." Master Qingyun also had 5 grandchildren, so he was no stranger to carrying a baby. Reaching out to take the child in his arms, he carefully looked at him, then looked at Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao and said, this child looks more like Li. Mo Xiaoyao smiled and nodded, but in his heart, he did not agree. Those who had seen Mo Xiaoyao and those who were close to him all said that he looked like Mo Xiaoyao. Those who were close to Yi Li all said that he looked like Yi Li. However, Mo Xiaoyao did not care who this little brat resembled. Yi Li smiled as she looked at Mo Xiaoyao. She knew what he was thinking, but she didn't point it out. Since Mr. Qingyun was holding the child, the others were too embarrassed to rush to see it. However, they couldn't help but glance over. Even Su Hongyu, who had been sitting still recently, turned to look at the child in Mr. Qingyun's arms. With so many pairs of eyes staring at him, how could Mr. Qingyun not feel it? He smiled and handed the baby to Su Hongyu and said, "Look, this child looks good." Once the child was in Su Hongyu's hands, the others did not have so many worries. Su Qingyan directly pulled Su Qingbai over to look. Although he had seen the baby before, Mo Xiaobao was getting cuter and cuter. He changed his appearance every day and could not get enough of looking at him. Su Qingchen also stood up and walked behind her father to look at the baby in his arms. It was Madame Su who said, "How can the child be comfortable with so many people surrounding him? Master also doesn't know how to hold a child. Let me hold him." So the baby went from Su Hongyu's hands to Madame Su. Then the onlookers became second Madame Su and Qin Zheng. Mo Xiaobao was passed around in everyone's hands. He did not cry. Madame Su was surprised and said, "This child is so obedient." Even Qingze, who was the least noisy in our family, was not so obedient. Mo Xiaoyao's mouth twitched slightly. He stared at the red ball in Madame Su's hands with disdain. Obedient? Who was the kid who cried every night and insisted on being held by Li? Su Hongyu smiled and said, "What's the child's name?" Su Qingyan answered first, "Mo Xiaobao." Su Hongyu was stunned and his mouth twitched. What kind of name was this? Yi Li pursed her lips and smiled, "I haven't had time to give him a name. I was waiting for grandfather to come and give him a name. I just gave him a nickname." Could she tell her grandfather and uncle that the baby's father's tendency to name him was to embarrass the baby when he grew up? Mr. Qingyun was stunned for a moment, but he was very happy about it. He bowed his head and thought for a moment, "In that case, how about Yu Chen?" Yu had the meaning of commanding and commanding. Chen meant emperor. Everyone present was well read, and such a name caused everyone to be stunned. Su Qingbai frowned slightly. He hesitated and asked, "Grandfather, is this name?" Mr. Qingyun smiled faintly and said, "It's just a name. I think this child is suitable for this name." Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and nodded, "Mr. Qingyun is right. It's just a name. I's son can't use a good name." Everyone was silent. Was this a problem of a name? No one dared to use such a name, even the emperor's son. Su Qingbai glanced at his grandfather, who had a calm expression on his face. His grandfather was a great scholar. He would know the meaning of this name, and he would never not know what was taboo. Since his father, eldest brother, and Prince Ding did not object, everyone must know. So he smiled and said, "I thought wrong." Madame Su saw that everyone had no objection. She looked lovingly at the baby in her arms and smiled, "Little baby, your name will be Mo Yuchen from now on." Little Yuchen. Mo Xiaoyao glanced at the baby and said, "Madame Su, you don't have to be so polite. Just call him Mo Xiaobao." Mo Xiaoyao spared no effort to destroy his son's reputation. He had to nail his nickname before Mo Xiaobao could speak. Mrs. Su was stunned. She looked at the baby in her arms, who was staring at her with big round eyes. She smiled and said, "Xiaobao. It's really a baby." Yi Li covered her face helplessly. "Xiaobao, I'm sorry." After the women and the baby went to rest, the hall quieted down. Mr. Qingyun looked sideways at Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li sitting side by side. A trace of relief flashed in his eyes and he asked, "Prince, have you really made up your mind?" Everyone was startled and looked at Mo Xiaoyao in unison. Mo Xiaoyao's lips twitched slightly and he smiled coldly. What choice do I have to make? Didn't the royal family choose a Prince Ding mansion more than 10 years ago? Everyone present couldn't help but fall silent. It was easy for power to intoxicate people. Back then, the ancestral emperor and the Ding king, Mo Lanyun, had sworn an oath that their descendants would be brothers forever and share the great Chu Empire. It might not have been a pretense, but it had only been a few generations, and the two families had already reached the point of life and death. The royal family's methods and actions were really too chilling. Su Hongyu looked at Mo Xiaoyao and said, Prince, do you have any plans now? Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and said, Of course I have plans, but I need to plan slowly. Su Hongyu nodded. It is good that the prince can calm down. The most worrying thing about Mo Xiaoyao's current situation was that he couldn't keep his cool. Having just learned of the blood feud between his father and brother, as well as the pointless sacrifice of so many Mahist army, there weren't many people who could keep their cool. But compared to the Central Plains and Jiangnan, the Northwest was more remote and barren. If Prince Ding was too impatient and prematurely advanced, and if Mo Jingqi decided to fight to the death, in the end, both sides would suffer and the fishermen would benefit. Mo Xiaoyao understood Su Hongyu's meaning and smiled faintly. So many years have passed, what can't I wait for? Don't worry, Mr. Hongyu. In the future, many matters in the Northwest will have to trouble Mr. Hongyu and Mr. Hongyan. With these words, he had the intention of entrusting them with important tasks. Su Hongyu nodded slightly. It is my duty. Chapter 456. Yi Li said, Li Er has prepared a residence not far from the Wang Fu for my two uncles. However, due to the lack of time, there are still many places that have not been cleaned up. I will have to trouble my uncles and cousins to stay in the Wang Fu for the time being. Originally, Yi Li had thought that everyone would stay in the Wang Fu. After all, the Wang Fu was big enough and there was no need to worry about not having enough space. However, both of her uncles were elders after all, and they each had their own families. Her cousins, other than her fifth brother, were all of marriageable age. Although living in the Wang Fu would not cause her uncles, aunts, and cousins to feel uncomfortable, she was worried that they would feel uncomfortable. Su Hongyu nodded and said, Li Er has troubled you. Yi Li smiled and looked eagerly at Master Qingyun, saying, Grandfather, how about living in the Wang Fu? If Li Er and Prince have any questions, they can ask me at any time. Nonsense. Master Qingyun glanced at her and softly reprimanded, how can a grandfather stay at his granddaughter's home? If other people knew, they would think that your uncle is unfilial. Also, the residence that you have arranged will not be far from the Wang Fu. If you miss your grandfather, you can just walk around more. Also, grandfather is used to living in the countryside and is not used to places that are too lively. Yi Li naturally knew that Master Qingyun would not allow it. She was not dejected and said with a smile, Li Er is fooling around. Grandfather, uncle, don't be angry. There is a residence on a mountain 5 li outside the city. The scenery is not bad. Prince had someone buy it a few days ago. Just treat it as a gift from Li Er and Prince to grandfather. Grandfather, please do not refuse. Master Qingyun's expression was gentle as he said with a faint smile, Grandfather knows that you are filial. Grandfather will not refuse. We can go back and reopen the academy. Thinking of the Lishan Academy that had already been turned to ashes, Master Qingyun was not without any sadness. Although all the ancient books had been taken away, Lishan Academy was an ancient place with special meaning. Yi Li nodded and said, Grandfather, do not worry. Lishan Academy will definitely be reopened. It will be even better than before. Master Qingyun nodded, you are right. The Su family's welcoming banquet was held at the Dingwang Fu. In order to show respect to the Su family, Mo Xiaoyao invited all the civil and military officials in Ruyang. He even informed the Prince Ding Mansion's trusted elites stationed in other prefectures in the northwest. She very seriously introduced the Su family to the generals and officials of the Northwest. It also made everyone understand that the Su family was not just the maternal family of Ding Wangfei. In the future, they would have an important position in the Northwest. And because of the Su family's original reputation, people naturally didn't have any thoughts of rejection or jealousy. As long as one was slightly knowledgeable, they would understand that the Su family coming to the Northwest at this time would only be beneficial to Prince Sting's residence and the Mo family army. The banquet was naturally very lively, and the atmosphere was harmonious and festive. Walking back with the others, when they passed through the garden, they saw Qin Zheng sitting alone in the pavilion by the pond, lost in thought. Yili stopped and asked softly, "Why is Sister Zheng here?" Qin Shuang said, "Just now at the banquet, Miss Qin seemed to be a little uncomfortable, so she left first." Qin Shuang said, "Miss Qin came to the Northwest alone, perhaps she is not used to it." Yili lowered her eyebrows and thought for a moment, then said, "Wait here for a while." Yili walked into the pavilion with light steps and laughed softly, "Sister Zheng, why are you sitting here?" Qin Zheng was clearly startled. Turning back to see Yili, she let out a sigh of relief and stood up, "Wang Fei." Yili reached out to stop her from standing up. She said with a helpless smile, "It's only been a year, but Sister Zheng and I have become more distant." Qin Zheng looked awkwardly at Yili, not knowing what to say. Yili said with a smile, "Could it be that after Sister Zheng and Ji get married, you will continue to call me Wang Fei?" Qin Zheng's face reddened and she stared helplessly at Yili, feeling a bit more at ease. After teasing, Yili sat down and held Qin Zheng's hand, saying, "I see that Sister Zheng is unhappy. Is there something you are not used to, or did the Fu neglect you in some way?" Qin Zheng quickly shook her head, the corners of her eyes red. She said in a low voice, "Everyone is very good to me. It's just, I miss home. Father and mother raised me and were very obedient. But I have not repaid them at all and have left them. I am really unfilial." Yili sighed softly and patted Qin Zheng's hand. She said softly, "Lord Qin and Madame Qin are willing to let sister leave the capital. Naturally, it is for sister's happiness. Sister, you just have to settle down in the Northwest. It's not like you will never have a chance to meet again. Right now, the most important thing is Gu and Sister Zheng's marriage. In the evening, eldest aunt and second aunt told me about this matter. It seems that Gu and second aunt are anxious to marry Sister Zheng. Li. Qin Zheng's beautiful face was so red it could drip blood. But she could not avoid Yili's teasing and could only cover her face with her hands. She said discontentedly, "We haven't seen each other for a year. Why is Li learning from Murong?" Yili said with a smile, "What's wrong with learning from Murong? Say what is on your mind, lest it bothers you. Alright, sister, don't be shy. If it wasn't for Gu accompanying me to the Northwest last year, you two would have been married a long time ago. Sister Zheng, just be at ease and be a bride. Li will definitely prepare a grand wedding for sister and Gu." Qin Zheng lowered her head and hid the tears in her eyes. She said in a low voice, "Li thank you." Yili said with a smile, "We are family. What is there to thank me for?" Qin Zheng smiled but did not speak. She was just a girl in her teens. How could she not feel uneasy after leaving her parents and the capital to go to the Northwest? Although the Su family was not difficult to get along with and second Madame Su took great care of her. But without parents to rely on, for a girl like Qin Zheng who was raised in a boudoir, she still felt uneasy. Moreover, the Su family's second young master Su Qingze was a cold person. Naturally, he would not ask about Qin Zheng's well-being. This increased Qin Zheng's worry. After carefully comforting Qin Zheng, she called for the servant girl who served Qin Zheng and had Qin Yu personally send Qin Zheng back to the small courtyard where she was temporarily staying. Returning to the room, she saw that Mo Xiaoyao had already returned. He was lying on the side of the cradle with a bored expression, poking Mo Xiaobao's delicate little face and playing with it. Yili washed up and changed her clothes. She helplessly said, "Prince, do you want to poke Baobao's face until it becomes ugly?" When she came in, he was playing. She had already finished washing up and he was still playing. Even if he did not use any strength, Bao Bao's pink skin would not be able to endure his playfulness. Walking to the side of the cradle, she saw that the little fellow had already woken up and was looking at her with his large round eyes. Perhaps because he had just woken up, his large eyes were watery and he looked extremely aggrieved. Bending over to pick up the little fellow, Yili patted him with heartache and said, "Bao Bao, be good. Daddy is naughty. Let's ignore him." She softly whispered to Bao Bao as she slowly walked around the room to coax Bao Bao to sleep. She completely did not see a certain person's face darken behind her. He was naughty. That bastard boy was indeed his natural nemesis. Li actually said that he was naughty because of him. Chapter 457. Mo Xiaoyao's almost tangible resentment finally attracted Yili's attention. She turned to look at the man sitting by the bed, staring at the baby in her hands with a gloomy face, and sighed helplessly in her heart. Other men hated that they could not have a precious son, but the one in front of her was like his son was his enemy in his previous life. She carefully placed the baby in Mo Xiaoyao's hands and smiled. "Prince, are you still young? Why are you throwing a tantrum with the baby?" Mo Xiaoyao snorted and ravaged the little meatball in his hands with heartache. "Did you raise him to be so fat to eat?" Yili rolled her eyes. The baby was round, white and tender, but he was far from fat, okay? Fortunately, Mo Xiaoyao also knew that his Yili did not like others disdaining her precious son, so he did not say more. He only disdained Mo Xiaoyao, who did not know anything and was powerless to resist his ravaging, and asked, "Why did you come back so late?" Yili told him about seeing Qin Zheng in the garden and then asked, "Eldest aunt and second aunt's intention is to set the wedding date after the baby's 1-month birthday party. Eldest aunt's intention is to let sister Zheng get married from eldest uncle's residence. In my opinion, it is better to get married from the prince's residence. What do you think? After all, marrying from eldest uncle's home to second uncle's home did not seem right." Mo Xiaoyao thought for a moment and said, "We don't have any elders in our residence. You can't send Qin Zheng to get married. In terms of age, you are younger than her. How about this? General Liu, General Zhang, and their families are all in Ruyang. You see which family is suitable for them to take Qin Zheng as their adopted daughter. When the time comes, she will get married from the general's residence. General Liu and General Zhang are both top generals in the Mahist army. It is not a disgrace for Qin Zheng to become their disciple. In this way, the Su family and the Mahist army will be connected by marriage. After all, the Prince Ding mansion started with military exploits. With this relationship, it will be much more convenient for the Su family in the northwest." Both Zhang Qilan and Lu Jingxian were highly respected veterans of the Mahist army. With their support, the Mahist army's rejection of the Su family would be greatly reduced. At the end of the day, as long as it was an army, there was no one who wasn't xenophobic. Yili didn't expect Mo Xiaoyao to have thought of so many things in such a short time. Most of them were for the sake of the Su family. She felt a slight sweetness in her heart and said softly, "Thank you for thinking so much for the Su family." Mo Xiaoyao snorted softly and lowered his head to play with his son. Yili looked helplessly at the man who lowered his head and ignored her. She really wanted to ask, "Prince, are you being arrogant?" The news of the birth of the little heir of Prince Ding's residence spread to the surrounding countries at an extremely fast speed. Not to mention, Mo Xiaoyao had also sent out invitations everywhere to invite the influential officials of various countries to Ruyang to attend the little heir's 1-month-old birthday banquet. After receiving the gorgeous invitation with the Ding mansion symbol, countless people smashed the priceless antiques and calligraphy in the study. Shilin Jinan Palace. In the study, Genin of Gojoseon stared at the gorgeous invitation on the table and narrowed his eyes dangerously. Genin of Gojoseon didn't say anything. The other people in the study naturally didn't dare to speak either. For a moment, the atmosphere was heavy and oppressive. After a long time, Genin of Gojoseon's son, Lei Tingfeng, who was standing to the side, said, "Father, what does Mo Xiaoyao mean by this? Is he really going to break off relations with the Dechu state?" As the Prince Ding of the Dechu state, no matter how famous the Ding mansion was, they didn't have the qualifications to invite the influential officials of the various countries to a prince's one-month-old celebration. In fact, even the royal families of the various countries wouldn't invite the influential officials of other countries to a prince's one-month-old celebration. However, if Mo Xiaoyao broke off relations with the Dechu state and established himself as the king, then at least he had the qualifications to speak with the royal families of the various countries. Thus, this invitation wasn't considered disrespectful. As for whether Mo Xiaoyao was willing to hold a one-month-old celebration for his son, no one could stop him. Genin of Gojoseon sneered, "The Ding mansion and the Dechu state will break off relations sooner or later. It's not unexpected. However, I didn't expect that Princess Ding would be able to return alive." What was even more unexpected was that after falling from such a high cliff, not only was Princess Ding fine, even the child in her stomach was fine. Mo Xiaoyao's luck was so good that it made people hate him. Thinking of this matter, Genin of Gojoseon's face became even uglier. Not only did he lose to a woman, but it was also a pregnant woman. Yi Li. Genin of Gojoseon gritted his teeth. Lei Tingfeng glanced at his father's sinister face. However, he wasn't as angry as Genin of Gojoseon. Thinking of the graceful woman in green who looked elegant but always shocked people, Lei Tingfeng couldn't deny that when he heard the news of Princess Ding's death, he also felt a faint sense of pity. He didn't expect that Princess Ding would return safely and give birth to Prince Ding's son. A faint sense of envy arose in Lei Tingfeng's heart. However, he quickly dismissed this thought. "Father, should we go to Prince Ding's one-month-old celebration?" Although Ruyang wasn't far from the Dechu state and the Xiling border, it wasn't close to the Xiling palace. This invitation was probably sent out by Prince Ding the moment he was born. It didn't even have the name of the little prince. Even so, if they wanted to attend the banquet, they had to leave immediately. Otherwise, they might not be able to make it in time. "We're going. Of course we're going." Genin of Gojoseon laughed coldly. "Do you really think that Mo Xiaoyao is only doing this for his son's one-month-old celebration? I'm afraid that Ruyang City will be very lively this time." Lei Tingfeng lowered his eyebrows and thought for a moment. He immediately understood. "Father, are you talking about the Imperial Jade Seal and the previous dynasty's Gaozu's treasure?" Genin of Gojoseon nodded. "That's right. Rather than letting people sneak in and out of the northwest, it's better for him to open the door and invite them over. At the very least, these people can still be under his surveillance. Mo Xiaoyao has thought of a good idea." Lei Tingfeng frowned and said, "In Royal Father's opinion, is the Imperial Jade Seal really in Mo Xiaoyao's hands? The news we received seems to be that the Prince Ding Mansion's people are secretly looking for someone called Lin Yuan, and it's related to the Imperial Jade Seal." "Lin Yuan? Lin?" Genin of Gojoseon pondered. Lei Tingfeng said, "Lin is the previous dynasty's national surname. This Lin Yuan is also known as Tan Jiji. It's said that he wanted to kidnap Princess Ding to threaten Prince Ding in the northwest, but somehow the news leaked out and he was captured by Prince Ding. After Mo Xiaoyao released him, he spread the news. Not long after, the news spread that the Imperial Jade Seal was in the Prince Ding mansion. Not only the Prince Ding mansion, even Mo Jingqi is looking for him." Genin of Gojoseon thought for a while and said, "I have some impression of this Tan Jiji. Su Zuidi once said that he's an orphan of the previous dynasty's imperial family." "An orphan of the previous dynasty's imperial family?" Lei Tingfeng curled his lips disapprovingly. "It's been more than 100 years since the previous dynasty was destroyed. Who cares about orphans? If that's the case, who knows how many orphans there are in this world? Every time a dynasty changes, there will be a few descendants of the imperial family living among the common people. Who can really succeed in reviving the country? The reason why the story of enduring hardships can be passed down through the ages is because he's just an example." Father already knew the identity of this Tan Jiji? Genin of Gojoseon obviously didn't put Tan Jiji in his eyes. He smiled faintly and said, "It's not important to us whether he's a descendant of the previous dynasty's imperial family or a traitor. As long as he can help Mo Jingqi deal with the Prince Ding mansion, he's not an enemy to us. Since that's the case, I will naturally keep his identity a secret. It's a pity. That woman Su Zuidi. Since she can tell I his identity, how can she not tell others? Chapter 458. Lei Tingfeng frowned, then who does father think has the imperial jade seal? Genom of Gojoseon pondered for a moment and said, with the temperament of the people in the Ding mansion, the imperial jade seal is not important to them. Mo Xiaoyao is more arrogant than Mo Lufang. He disdains to use the imperial jade seal to raise the prestige of the Mahist army. Lei Tingfeng said, father means. Genom of Gojoseon waved his hand, no, the imperial jade seal may not be in Mo Xiaoyao's hands, but it may not be in Tan Jiji's hands either. So this trip, we must go to the northwest. At least, the imperial jade seal cannot fall into the hands of others. I understand. Lei Tingfeng nodded. Father is going to Ruyang personally. Genom of Gojoseon nodded, you go with I. There are no major events in West Hill recently. I accept. The atmosphere in the imperial study of the Chu Palace became more dignified. Mo Jingqi was so angry that his face turned black. He threw the invitation in his hand far away. Mu Chen. What a good Mu Chen. Mo Xiaoyao, you are very good. Mo Jingli, who also received an invitation and entered the imperial study, saw the invitation marked with the Prince Ding mansion's seal. Raising his hand to catch it, Mo Jingli smiled and said, brother, who made you so angry? Seeing this brother of the same mother, Mo Jingqi's face became more ugly. He said coldly, what are you doing in the imperial palace? Mo Jingli smiled and took out another invitation. He smiled and said, I came to pay my respects to mother. In addition, it seems that brother also received Prince Ding's invitation. What are you planning to do? He opened the invitation and saw the name of the heir of the Prince Ding mansion written on it, Mo Yuchen. Yuchen. What a good name. Mo Xiaoyao, you can't hold it in anymore. Mo Jingqi looked at his younger brother coldly. After his brother returned from the south, he had obviously become smarter and harder to deal with. If he didn't suddenly become enlightened, then there must be an expert guiding him from behind. What are your plans? Since Mo Xiaoyao sent someone to send you an invitation, does Imperial Brother plan to go? Mo Jingli smiled and said, Prince Ding personally sent an invitation, how could Imperial Brother not go? What gift does Imperial Brother intend to give to Prince Ding? Mo Jingqi coldly snorted. Suddenly, a malicious smile appeared on his face as he said, but Royal Brother should go. After all, Yi Li and Royal Brother are not strangers. Furthermore, she is Princess Consort Li's elder sister. At the mention of this, Mo Jingli's expression became ugly. Whenever he thought of Yi Li who only knew how to cry and whine in his fu, and then thought of Yi Li who could go to the battlefield and the court and had the support of the Su family behind her, Mo Jingli couldn't help but have a stomachache whenever he thought of the fact that Yi Li had once been his fiancée. If he had taken Yi Li back then, what would it have been like? With Yi Li's ability to defeat Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling, maybe he wouldn't have needed to fight his imperial brother in the north and south, and would have directly attacked the Chu capital. And that Su Qingchen, how much trouble had she caused for him in the south? If his princess consort was Yi Li, Su Qingchen would not only not cause trouble for him, she would help him. Maybe she could even help him take down Nanzhao, and not be controlled by Nanzhao like now. Seeing Mo Jingli's expression suddenly turn dark, Mo Jingqi's mood instantly improved. He raised an eyebrow and said, since Imperial Brother is going, why not bring Princess Consort Li with you? She can also reminisce about the past with Yi Li. Mo Jingli gritted his teeth and said lightly, many thanks for Imperial Brother's advice. Since this is the case, Chen Di will go and prepare first. Seeing that there isn't much time left, we will depart for the northwest tomorrow morning. Mo Jingqi nodded and said, Imperial Brother, please go. When Mo Jingli left, the smile on Mo Jingqi's face disappeared without a trace. Did Mo Jingli think that he didn't know what he wanted to do in the northwest? To celebrate Mo Xiaoyao's son's 1-month birthday, Humph. Mo Jingli would only want Mo Xiaoyao's son to die early more than him. Because the child's mother was his former fiancée. Yi Li's existence was simply telling everyone in the world that he, King Li, was blind as a bat. You want to go to the northwest to find the imperial jade seal? Mo Jingli, your appetite is a bit too big. Emperor. Is there any news of Tan Jiji's whereabouts? Mo Jingqi asked coldly as he looked at the grey-clothed person kneeling in the hall. Emperor, please forgive me. For now, there is no news of Tan Jiji's whereabouts. Bang! Mo Jingqi grabbed the inkstone on the table and threw it over. The grey-clothed person on the ground naturally didn't dare to dodge. The inkstone hit his shoulder and fell to the ground. The grey-clothed person gave a muffled grunt. Emperor, please forgive me. A group of trash. Go search again. Even if you have to dig 3 feet into the ground, you must find Tan Jiji for Zhen. Yes. There were still a few days until Prince Sting's 1-month-old banquet, but Ruyang City was already bustling with noise and excitement. Because of last year's war in the northwest, many wealthy merchants fled to the borders. As a result, the commerce in the northwest had stagnated and even regressed. This time, the moment Mo Xiaobao was born, the Prince Sting mansion announced to the world that they were wantonly celebrating the little heir. Because of the previous dynasty's treasures and the imperial jade seal, a steady stream of people poured into the northwest. In less than a month, Ruyang City seemed to have slowly become prosperous. Previously, the largest city in the northwest, Xinyang City, had turned into a sea of fire. Now that the Prince Sting mansion was stationed in Ruyang City seemed to gradually become the largest city in the northwest. In order to entertain guests from all over, the common people in the city had already tidied up their homes early on, preparing to take advantage of this bustle to make a fortune. In the Prince Sting mansion, because of the addition of the Su family, Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li felt a lot more relaxed. In the Su family, other than Master Qing Yun who was already old and enjoying his life in the mansion and would occasionally visit Su Zhe who was recuperating, Su Hongyu, Su Hongyan, and the 5 young masters of the Su family, even the youngest, Su Qingyan, could follow Su Qingbai and help out a little. Su Hongyu and Su Qingchen were originally rare geniuses. With them, Mo Xiaoyao immediately threw most of the affairs in the northwest to them. His days were very relaxed and comfortable. Li Er, did you write this thing? In the spacious study, several tables were placed together to form a large table. All kinds of documents and files were neatly arranged on top of it. Several people sat around the table. As they dealt with the files in their hands, they would occasionally exchange a few words. Although everyone had their own study, under normal circumstances, they still liked to deal with business in the large study. It was not cold and boring, and when they could not make up their minds, they could ask for the opinions of others. Su Qingchen raised his head and asked as he held a file about the business plans in the northwest. Yi Li raised her head from between the files and looked blankly at Su Qingchen. She did not know what he was talking about. Mo Xiaoyao, sitting next to her, glanced and said, "It's about the business development plan in the northwest." "Ah! I wrote it." Yi Li finally remembered. She said with some embarrassment, "Actually, I only have a general idea. I am not familiar with these things." "Didn't you say before that it was given to Mingxi and Ling Er to handle?" Mo Xiaoyao said, "Ling Er has returned to the pass. Han Mingxi has to manage the northwest and Nanzhao and Beirong by himself. He is too busy, so it was put aside for now." Hearing them say this, the others also raised their heads to look at Su Qingchen. Su Qingchen handed the file in his hand to Su Hongyu. Everyone looked at it. Su Hongyu nodded and praised, "Li Er's idea is very novel. We can try and see if it works." Although the Su family was a scholarly family, they were not pedantic. They naturally understood what business meant to a city and even a country. Compared to the rich Central Plains and the Jiangnan region, the Northwest was not considered to be rich. Even the food supply was relatively poor. If they could not find another way, there would be a day when the Mo army would gradually wither away due to the poverty in the Northwest. At first, When they saw Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao go in and out every day to deal with the politics of the Northwest and the military affairs of the Mahist army, everyone was surprised. But when they saw the Mahist army generals appear accustomed to it, they felt very gratified. Li had enough talent and ability. Most importantly, Prince Ding was willing to give her trust and space to show her ability. This made the Su family's impression of Mo Xiaoyao much better. Chapter 459. The dossier was passed around the room. Su Qingbai was the most interested in this plan. Originally, when he was sent to the southwest region, he was prepared to show off his skills but was summoned back to the capital. Now that he saw this plan, he immediately recalled the feeling of wanting to show off his ambitions when he first arrived in the southwest region. Li, what do you think? Looking up and seeing everyone staring at her, Yi Li could only put down the dossier in her hand and asked Zhuo Jing to bring over a map to hang on the wall. She also had someone bring over some freshly brewed tea. After thinking seriously for a while, she said, the Northwest's area is less than 1/6 of the Dechu states, and its population is less than 1/10 of the Dechu states. Although Hongzhou is known as the Northwest's granary, it is still lacking compared to the Southwest, which is known as Tianfu. If it were peacetime, it wouldn't matter. We would only need to import a small amount of food to feed the people and soldiers in the Northwest. But in reality, the worst-case scenario is that we might have to face the 3 million troops of the Dechu state, the northern tribes, and Xiling at the same time. And even if there is no war, the three countries only need to seal off the Northwest's food and economy. Even if the Northwest doesn't immediately fall into trouble, it will only become poorer and poorer. At the same time, the Mahist army will become weaker and weaker. Extinction is only a matter of time. Everyone was indifferent. What Yi Li said was the truth. It wasn't that the people present didn't know, but that no one had ever laid out the data so clearly in front of them. Because it was clear, it was even more shocking. Feng Jiao frowned. What if we take the initiative to attack? Expand our territory in the Northwest? Su Hongyu frowned. It's not impossible, but Xiling's land is barren. Most of their food comes from the Dechu state, Nanzhao, and the western countries. The northern tribes are vast grasslands and deserts. The northern tribes mainly eat cows and sheep. The Dechu state cannot be touched for the time being. Once the Mahist army moves against the Dechu state, it is very likely that Xiling, the northern tribes, and Nanzhao will attack the Mahist army at the same time. Actually, with the Mahist army's strength, what General Feng said might not be impossible, but the losses would be huge. I think Li Er's idea is to take it slow. Yi Li nodded. That's right. If we make the Northwest a mess, we will be the ones to clean up the mess. Unless we can take down Xiling or northern tribes within half a year. The Mahist army was not just any army to the Mahist army. Because no matter who wanted to conquer the world or do something else, if they were not strong enough, they would only be ignored by others. When they were strong enough, they could even do anything. As for the Mo family army, from the very beginning, they had been set as everyone's opponent too. Su Qingyan tilted his body and stretched his neck to look at the thing in Su Qingbai's hand. He asked, Sister Li has already considered so much. Then, there must be a way to solve it. Yi Li smiled helplessly. How can we solve these problems in such a short time? But I have ordered people to survey the entire Northwest region. Other than the vicinity of Hongzhou, in Ganzhou, which is the middle reaches of Min River, there is a large area of plains. The soil and water quality are excellent. It is just that this area is connected to the northern tribes, so there are very few people. Large areas of fertile land are not cultivated. Su Qingbai said thoughtfully, Li, you mean to move the people to Ganzhou to cultivate the land? Then there must be a large number of troops stationed at the border to prevent the northern tribes from raiding. Mo Xiaoyao nodded. This is not a problem. Now the Mahist army has hundreds of thousands of soldiers who have nothing to do. Moreover, the Mahist army will expand in the future. There is no need to worry about not having enough people to guard it. Yi Li also nodded. If the people are not assured, the Mahist army can cultivate the land first, or cultivate it together with the people. The Mahist army and the people cultivate together? Everyone frowned and hesitated. Su Qingchen raised his eyebrows and smiled. Li Er's idea is not bad. The hundreds of thousands of soldiers do not need to fight for the time being. Using them to cultivate the land is not bad. In this way, the Mahist army will have their own harvest and can also reduce the taxes of the people. Su Qingbai nodded and asked impatiently, then Li Er, what do you think of the business hub that you mentioned? Yi Li massaged her temples and tidied up her hair before saying, in this world, there is not only the Dechu state, the northern tribes, Xiling, and Nanzhao. To the west of Xiling, there are countless small countries and even large countries that we do not know of. It is only because of the long distance that most people do not know of them. Our northwest region is now surrounded by other countries. If we sell the goods of eastern Chu, northern tribes, and Nanzhao to the countries further west through Xiling, then bring their goods back and sell them to the Dechu state or the northern tribes, they will attract merchants. In the future, Ruyang and even the entire northwest region will become an important economic and trade area between the east and the west. Su Qingbai was a smart person and naturally understood at once. He smiled and said, Li Er, when do you plan on starting? You have to count me in. Me too. Su Qingyan had always adhered to the policy of following his fourth brother and quickly raised his hand to vote. Yi Li smiled and said, we have already sent some people to the agriculture area. As for business, fourth brother has no experience, you can ask Han Mingxi and Ling Haoyu. Thinking of the busy Han Mingxi and Ling Haoyu, Yi Li felt a headache coming on. She then thought of a certain person who was currently dispirited somewhere and felt some regret. She should not have killed Su Zuodi so quickly. Otherwise, she would have gotten such a good free worker. Reporting to Prince and Princess Consort, King Li and Princess Consort Li of the Chu capital have arrived. As she spoke, a guard came in to report. King Li. Mo Jingli. Yi Li was startled. She did not expect him to come to Ruyang and bring Yiying with him. Speaking of which, Yi Li had not seen Yiying for nearly 2 years. Originally, she had been imprisoned by Mo Jingqi. Now that Mo Jingli had returned to the capital and was holding a large number of troops, he seemed to be on par with Mo Jingqi. As Princess Consort Li, Yiying was naturally free. Mo Xiaoyao stood up and smiled. Mo Jingli. Since that's the case. Li, let's go welcome King Li and Princess Consort Li. I also want to see how much this Mo Jingli has grown after not seeing him for so long. Yi Li naturally did not have any objections. She stood up and followed Mo Xiaoyao outside. Only Su Qingbai still had questions to ask and seemed to want to continue. Although it was called a welcome, it was only when Chief Steward Mo invited them in that Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao walked to the entrance of the hall to welcome them. Mo Jingli clearly did not expect to receive any good treatment from Mo Xiaoyao. His expression was still normal. Just as they approached the Prince Ding Mansion's hall, they saw a beautiful couple standing at the entrance. Mo Xiaoyao was dressed in a light purple brocade robe. His snow-white hair was casually pulled back. Compared to before, he seemed to be more cold and intimidating. Yi Li, on the other hand, was dressed in a light green dress with a silver peony pattern. Her smile was as gentle as before, but there was more nobility and charm between her brows. Seeing the smiling green-clothed woman standing beside Mo Xiaoyao, Mo Jingli's eyes flashed. For a moment, he did not know what to feel. Chapter 460. Li Wang and Li Wang Fei are honored by your presence, welcome. Seeing that Mo Xiaoyao did not plan on speaking, Yi Li said with a faint smile. Before this year, Yiying was very different from the fourth miss of the Yi family whose name had spread through the capital. Her expression, which had always been weak and helpless, was now filled with hidden bitterness and stupefaction. Her watery eyes, which were as clear as autumn waters, had become much sharper, and her originally weak temperament had weakened a lot. Following silently by Mo Jingli's side, she looked more like a princess than before. But Yi Li did not miss the hint of jealousy and bitterness that flashed through Yi Ying's eyes when she looked at her. She couldn't help but laugh inside. Yi Ying might have suffered greatly these past 2 years, but what did she have to be jealous of her? Jealous that she had led troops to battle and risked her life on the battlefield? Or jealous that she had almost lost her life when she fell off the cliff? Mo Jingli looked at the two people standing side by side in front of him and said coolly, "Long time no see, how have you been?" Mo Xiaoyao raised an eyebrow in surprise. Mo Jingli knew how to greet him properly. It seemed that he had learned some bad things in the past year. He nodded coolly and said with a faint smile, "Thank you for your concern." Mo Jingli's expression froze and he looked as ugly as if he had swallowed a fly. Who was concerned about him? Yi Li smiled and looked at Mo Xiaoyao. Mo Jingli said with a smile, "Please come in." After entering the hall and sitting down, Yi Li noticed that Mo Jingli had brought another person. It was also a familiar face that she had not seen in a long time, Princess Xixia. Princess Xixia was dressed as a servant girl and followed beside Mo Jingli. But she kept her head down. Yi Li thought that she was just a normal servant girl. However, she followed everyone into the hall. Yi Li realized that something was wrong. No wonder Yi Ying's expression was so ugly. When Mo Jingli left the Chu capital, he brought Princess Xixia with him. She didn't expect that he would bring her with him to the northwest. Clearly, Mo Jingli treated Princess Xixia differently. The host and guests sat down. Yi Li hesitated for a moment, then looked at Princess Xixia and said, "This is..." Before Mo Jingli could say anything, Yi Ying opened her mouth and said indifferently, "She's just a servant girl." "Third sister, why do you care about her?" Hearing this, Mo Jingli's expression darkened. Princess Xixia's expression was also ugly. Originally, with Princess Xixia's status, she was more than qualified to be an equal concubine. But after the commotion at the wedding, Princess Xixia had no choice but to fake her death to discuss this matter. Originally, Yi Li thought that Mo Jingli would quickly find another identity for Princess Xixia. She didn't expect that even now, this concubine's identity was still unknown. Seeing that Mo Jingli didn't speak, Yi Li didn't care. She ordered someone to bring tea. "Prince Ding's current appearance has given I quite a fright," Yi Futian said. Mo Jingli said. Although he had long heard of Prince Ding's white hair, Mo Jingli was still a little surprised to see it with his own eyes. He glanced sideways at Yi Li sitting next to Mo Xiaoyao. In his mind, he assessed that Yi Li was more important to Mo Xiaoyao than they thought. Mo Xiaoyao didn't care at all. He casually brushed back the hair that fell to his chest and said with a smile, "Flowers bloom and wilt. Birth, old age, illness, and death are all normal. Why care? But I heard that Prince Li has been very proud of his success in Jiangnan this year." Mo Jingli tugged at the corner of his lips and said, "Prince Ding overpraises me. How can I be as free as Prince Ding who occupies the northwest?" The two men began to argue back and forth. If it was in the past, Mo Jingli might not have had the courage and confidence to contend with Mo Xiaoyao. But it was different now. Mo Xiaoyao occupied the northwest, while he occupied Jiangnan. Compared to the barren and rich northwest, Jiangnan clearly had an advantage. Yi Li smiled at Yi Ying and said with a smile, "Fourth sister, how have you been this year?" Yi Ying looked at Yi Li with a complicated expression. She snorted and said with a cold smile, "Third sister, don't you know that I was imprisoned by the emperor? How good can a prisoner be?" Her words seemed to be blaming Yi Li for not saving her when she knew that Mo Jingchi had imprisoned her. Yi Li didn't care. She and Yi Ying didn't have a deep sisterly relationship. If it was said that it was a small matter, she would have saved her. But at that time, Yi Ying could be said to be Mo Jingchi's hostage to Mo Jingli. Naturally, she would be heavily guarded. Why would she waste the effort to sacrifice her own subordinate? Yi Li's expression was normal in the face of Yi Ying's questioning. She comforted her, "Now that fourth sister and Prince Li have reunited, and you have Prince Li's heir, your days will be over." Hearing this, Yi Ying's face darkened and her expression became even uglier. Yi thought for a moment and immediately understood. Mo Jingli probably didn't intend to make Yi Ying's child the heir. That's right. Mo Jingli was still young. If he wanted to have a child, how could he not have one? And Yi Ying could be said to have no foundation other than her half-sister. She couldn't even compare to the families of ordinary officials. And her sister didn't have a good relationship with her. The two families were even enemies. Of course, Mo Jingli wouldn't consider making Yi Ying's child the heir. He was probably already planning to choose a woman with a good family background as his concubine. Yi Li naturally couldn't care about these things. She simply didn't ask and pulled Yi Ying to talk about other things. Yi Ying listened to Yi Li in silence. After a long time, she suddenly asked, "Third sister, why do you want father to retire and return to his hometown?" Yi Li raised her eyebrows. Was she questioning her? Yi Li pursed her lips and smiled faintly. Her smile was a little cold. Father is old and has risen to the top in the imperial court. What's wrong with retiring at the top? Yi Ying bit her lip and looked at Yi Li resentfully. No one knew how she felt after being released from the prison and finding out that her parents and relatives were no longer in the capital. Prince didn't care about her as much as before. He was just cold and indifferent. He didn't even look at her child. If father was still here, he wouldn't be like this. Yi Li certainly understood Yi Ying's unwillingness and resentment. She sneered in her heart. If Minister Yi didn't retire and return to his hometown, he would have been killed by Mo Jingqi. He wouldn't have waited for Yi Ying to come out. She originally thought that Yi Ying had grown up after more than a year of suffering. Now it seemed that she was still so naive and ignorant. Although Yi Ying and Yi Li were relatives, Yi Li didn't arrange for Mo Jingli and his group to stay in the Prince Ding mansion. Instead, she arranged for them to stay in a courtyard specially set aside in Ruyang City. This place was specially prepared to receive dignitaries or envoys from various countries. Although the Mahist army didn't have a good relationship with the various countries, war wasn't something that could be easily started. It was impossible for people to not interact with each other. Although this courtyard wasn't as luxurious as the rest of the post house in the Chu capital, it wasn't bad at the time and was big enough. Even if people from the Chu state's northern tribes and Shilin came, they didn't have to worry about not being able to accommodate them. Before she could arrange for Mo Jingli and his group to stay, Director Mo came to report, "Prince, Princess Consort, Genom of Gojoseon of Shilin and Genom of Gojoseon of Shilin have arrived. The Crown Prince of the Northern Tribes has also arrived with the Crown Princess and the 7th Prince. The Crown Princess of Nanzhao has also arrived." Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li looked at each other. This time, the 4 countries were all present, and the missions they sent out were all very important. This gave enough face to Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao. Of course, they couldn't rule out the possibility that the Dechu state and the Mahist army were involved. A cold light flashed in Mo Xiaoyao's eyes. He stood up with a smile and pulled Yi Li. He smiled and said, "It seems that there are many important guests today. Li, let's go out and welcome them." Yi Li smiled and nodded, then followed Mo Xiaoyao out. Chapter 461. It was bustling and crowded outside the main entrance of Prince Ding's residence. It was unknown if it was a coincidence or if it was done on purpose, but the distinguished guests from the 3 countries had rushed to the entrance of Prince Ding's residence at the same time. Hence the entrance of Prince Ding's residence was completely surrounded by the carriages, attendants and guards of these people. However, with the Black Cloud Cavalry acting as guards outside the Prince Ding mansion, these people could not even think about getting close to the Prince Ding mansion. The Prince Ding mansion's door opened from the inside. Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li came out hand in hand. Under the sunlight, the snow-white hair flashed with a cold luster. The people who just came out of the carriage were stunned. They were the most powerful group of people in their respective kingdoms. They had already received Mo Xiaoyao's white hair message. But just like Mo Jingli, when they saw the white-haired man in front of them, they could not hide their surprise. But what was puzzling was that when the princess consort fell off the cliff and disappeared, Prince Ding was fine. How come when Princess Ding came back, Prince Ding's hair turned white overnight? You have all come from afar. I hope you will forgive me for being late. Mo Xiaoyao glanced at the crowd and smiled apologetically. We dare not. We are already familiar with Prince Ding. Prince Ding, why are you being so polite? This is Princess Ding. Seeing you today, you really live up to your reputation. The young man in the royal family of the northern tribes was tall and straight. He had the rough and handsome appearance of the people of the northern tribes, but his aura was extraordinary. Standing beside him was the seventh prince of the northern tribes, Yelu Yi, and Princess Ronghua, who had not been seen for a long time. Princess Ronghua nodded at Yi Li and smiled faintly. Her beautiful face was not as pale and delicate as it was in the Chu capital. Instead, it was more rosy and healthy. It seemed that Princess Ronghua had been living well in the northern tribes for more than a year. The man who spoke was naturally the crown prince of the northern tribes, Yelu Hong. Yi Li smiled faintly and said, Crown prince of the northern tribes, you flatter me. Since everyone has come from afar, please come in and have a cup of tea before resting at the post house. Yelu Hong looked at Yi Li with some surprise, then said with a smile, Thank you, Wang Fei. Princess Anqi stepped forward and said with a smile, Princess Ding, long time no see. How have you been? Yi Li felt a little embarrassed when she saw Princess Anqi's bright smile. She had deceived Princess Anqi more than once in Nanzhao, yet Princess Anqi was still speaking to her in such a pleasant manner. She wondered how much face Su Qingchen had given her. Princess Ding nodded and said with a smile, Big sister princess, I trust you have been well since we last met. It just so happens that Big Brother is also in Ruyang. Princess, you can reminisce about old times with Big Brother. Everyone knew that Princess Ding did not have an elder brother in her family, so who else could she call Big Brother? Yi Li wasn't afraid to tell everyone that Su Qingchen was in the northwest. She didn't want the Su family to hide. Since she had to tell her sooner or later, it was no big deal to tell her now. Sure enough, Princess Anqi smiled more happily after hearing the news about Su Qingchen. She said with a smile, Thank you, Wang Fei. Princess Ding, how have you been? Lei Tingfeng from the West Hill came forward to greet her. Although all the countries had some grudges against the Mahist army, the West Hill was in the most awkward position. Last year, the two armies fought a war and hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the West Hill died in the northwest. Of course, the Mahist army's Wang Fei falling off a cliff was more serious. Therefore, even if the two sides temporarily put aside their grudges and pretended to be at peace, they still felt a little uncomfortable. Mo Xiaoyao stepped forward and held Yi Li's slender waist with one hand. He smiled at Lei Tingfeng and said, Thank you for your concern. Princess Li is very lucky. Lei Tingfeng was also helpless. He wasn't the one who caused Princess Ding to fall off the cliff. But it didn't seem to make any difference if it was his own father. He laughed dryly and said, The Wang Fei is indeed very lucky to have turned misfortune into a blessing. Yi Li patted Mo Xiaoyao's hand quietly and said to the crowd with a smile, It's rude of the Prince Ding mansion to let you talk at the door. Please come in. Mo Xiaoyao snorted lightly and glanced at Genom of Gojoseon who was sizing up Yi Li. Then he stepped aside and let them in. Genom of Gojoseon said lightly, I haven't seen you for a year. Prince Ding's kung fu cultivation has become more profound. I wonder if we can have a spar when you're free. Mo Xiaoyao smiled ferociously at a place where no one could see. He tilted his head slightly and said, I'll keep you company anytime. Princess Ding, it's been a long time. How are you? As if teasing Mo Xiaoyao wasn't enough, Genom of Gojoseon turned his gaze to Yi Li and asked Yi Li with a smile. Yi Li nodded lightly and said, Thank you for Genom of Gojoseon's concern. Ben Fei is well. But Prince Ding's injury, is it serious? Sensing that Mo Xiaoyao's hand around her waist had tightened, Yi Li could only hate herself for not using more strength to take his life back then. Genom of Gojoseon seemed to remember the wound that Yi Li had given him. He smiled regretfully and said, I will never forget Wang Fei's gift. Yi Li's eyes darkened and she said coolly, Is that so? Ben Fei will also never forget it. Back then, I was careless and didn't hit the target. Genom of Gojosian smiled and said, then this one thanks Wang Fei for being merciful. After finally settling the guests, Mo Xiaoyao and Yili returned to the study. Only Su Qingchen was left in the study. Seeing them come in, he raised his head and smiled. You've returned? Yili smiled and said, Dagu is still busy. Aren't you going to see your good friend? Su Qingchen raised his eyebrows and said, Anshi is here? Yili nodded and said, right now, Nanzhao doesn't seem to be able to send any other important envoys other than Princess Anshi. Dagu isn't going to see her. Just now, Princess Anshi's face was filled with disappointment when she left. Su Qingchen glanced coolly at her and said coolly, I will go visit Princess Anshi later. Why are you in such a hurry? Yili was helpless. Her Dagu was like an immortal that mortals could not afford to offend. It was really depressing. Walking through thousands of flowers without a single leaf touching him. No, he didn't even walk through the flowers. He just looked at them from a distance that was neither close nor far, neither light nor heavy. He made people feel that he was close and gentle, as if he was within reach. But when they really touched him, they felt that he was beyond the 9 heavens. Even her eldest aunt was slightly worried that her Dagu would see through the mortal world and cultivate immortality. It was not that Yili wanted to put her Dagu and Princess Anshi together. But these years, the only woman who could get close to her Dagu was Princess Anshi. Genom of Gojosian of Xiling, heir Genom of Gojosian, the crown prince of the northern tribes and the 7th prince, the crown princess of Nanzhao and Prince Li of Dechu state. Hearing Yili mention the people who came this time, Su Qingchen said thoughtfully, even if it's for the so-called Imperial Jade Seal, the people who came this time are a little too important. These people were the most important people in all countries. Genom of Gojosian of Xiling was even more important than the Emperor of Xiling. These people all gathered in Ruyang. If it was just for the Imperial Jade Seal, it would be making a mountain out of a molehill. Yili smiled and said, Dagu and Xiaoyao are the same. They don't think much of the Imperial Jade Seal, but others may not think so. The so-called Imperial Jade Seal, whoever obtains it can obtain the world. Yili felt that this sentence had always been sarcastic. It should be, whoever obtains the world can obtain it. Whether it was the ancient emperor or the recent Gaozu of the previous dynasty, who didn't obtain the Imperial Jade Seal when they were close to the end of the country. If you don't have anything, even if the Imperial Jade Seal fell from the sky and landed in your arms, you would only be cannon fodder. Chapter 462. Ali is right. With the Imperial Jade Seal, you will have the so-called fate of the heavens. What's more, it is said that the great ancestor of the previous dynasty's treasure house contains the secret books of the great ancestor of the previous dynasty and the treasures left behind when the country was founded. Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly. In the eyes of those people, the most valuable thing was not the treasures, but the great ancestor's art of war. Who dared to compare the art of war with the Mahist army? Originally, there was also Genom of Gojosian who was known as the West Hill god of war. However, since Genom of Gojosian was defeated by Princess Ding, in the eyes of the West Hill soldiers, the Mahist army was simply Genom of Gojosian's nemesis. Genom of Gojosian was invincible throughout his life, but he was defeated by the Mahist army again and again. It was understandable that he was defeated by Mo Lufang. After all, the Prince Ding mansion had a long history and Mo Lufang was a genius of a generation. However, it was unreasonable that he was defeated by Princess Ding. A teenage girl from a scholarly family could defeat Genom of Gojosian who had experienced hundreds of battles. If she was not a natural nemesis, then what was? Speaking of the Imperial Jade Seal, Yili could not help but frown and ask, will Tanjiji come to the northwest this time? Mo Xiaoyao nodded and said, Xu Manlin is still in Ruyang. Unless Tanjiji doesn't want her anymore, he will definitely come. Xu Manlin. Su Qingchen raised his eyebrows and smiled. He did not know when the Saintess of Nanjiang came to the northwest. Yili smiled and said, I forgot to tell you. Speaking of which, you and the Saintess of Nanjiang are old acquaintances. Previously, the Saintess of Nanjiang mentioned you to me. Do you want to meet him? Su Qingchen rubbed Yi Li's head helplessly, ignoring Mo Xiaoyao's displeased look. She smiled and said, "Forget it. I'm sure she doesn't want anyone else to know that she's here." The Saintess of the southern border was not allowed to leave the southern Zhao imperial city. If the people of the southern border found out, then Xu Manlan's position as the Saintess of the southern border would come to an end. In Ruyang City, people came from all over the place to participate in the grand event. This city, which was originally not very famous in the northwest, suddenly became bustling and lively. Many foreign peddlers had appeared on the streets, peddling various goods from the pass, Western Hill, Northern Army, and Southern Zhao to the pedestrians. The various inns, restaurants, and tea-houses in the city were also filled with people. It was not only the envoys from the imperial court who entered the city every day. There were also merchants from various places, swordsmen from Jianghu, and even travelers. The entire Ruyang city appeared to be unprecedentedly lively and prosperous. Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion was a newly opened singing and dancing establishment in Ruyang City, but in less than 2 months, it had become the #1 singing and dancing establishment in the northwest. But Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion was completely different from ordinary brothels. The girls of Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion only sold their skills and not their bodies. Rather than calling it a singing and dancing establishment, it was better to call it a restaurant. Because not only were there the most beautiful girls, there was also the best wine and the most delicious wine. Here, you could find girls to listen to music and dance, but you could not have girls accompany you to drink, let alone other services. Therefore, Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion not only entertained male guests, but also female guests. But people had this kind of temperament. The more you were not allowed to do something, the more you would think she was the best. After all, listening to music, drinking wine, and admiring beauties was the same. Going to a brothel and drinking tea at Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion, the latter was more elegant. Moreover, the beauties in Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion were genuine beauties. They didn't have the heavy makeup and coquettish voices of those in brothels. Each and every one of them wore the same style and color of clothes as they served dishes in Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion. As for those who performed music, chess, calligraphy, painting, poetry, singing and dancing, they were the beauties of beauties. Not to mention these barren lands without many beauties in the northwest, even the scholars and poets from Jiangnan would be intoxicated. Yi Li sat in a wing room on the second floor of Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion, leaning against the window and looking outside. It was already night, but all of Ruyang City was brightly lit like it was daytime. There was a high platform across from Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion. It seemed to be playing some kind of arena game. There was a flow of people downstairs, and it seemed to be more lively than during the day. "It's so late, Wang Fei, why have you come out?" Yaoji was wearing a red robe. Her beautiful face had recovered 70 to 80%. She did not look as beautiful as before, but people felt she was more gentle and moving. Pushing open the door and coming in, Yaoji leaned against the door and asked with a smile. Yi Li smiled faintly and said, "I had nothing to do, so I came out to see. You've managed Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion well." Yaoji curled her lips and said, "Yes, it's good. I have to thank you for your kindness, Wang Fei. Otherwise, it would be a pity for so many beauties in Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion to become prostitutes." Yi Li looked at her with a faint smile and said, "Who said that beauties must open brothels? There are many brothels under Tianyi Pavilion. It's not worthwhile to open another one. Besides, Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion may not earn less than your Qingqing Lane, right?" Yaoji nodded and said with a smile, "You're right, Wang Fei. Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion's expenses were extremely high." Even Yaoji, who used to run the #1 brothel in the capital, couldn't help but be speechless. However, business was very good these days. In less than half a month, they made a lot of money. Therefore, there was one thing that was right. People were born to be cheap. Remember, if you want a girl to accompany you, tell them to go to those brothels by themselves. The concentrated fragrance pavilion only provides the best wine, the best dishes, the most pleasant tunes, the most beautiful dances, and the most exciting talent shows. Nothing else. Yili ordered as she watched the scene downstairs. Yaoji nodded and said, Yaoji understands. Speaking of which, today, Prince Li, the 7th prince of the northern tribes, and the crown prince of Shiling Genom of Gojoseon all came to concentrated fragrance pavilion. Yili smiled and said, Concentrated fragrance pavilion has risen too quickly. It would be strange if they didn't come. Don't pay attention to them. Do what you need to do. Yaoji covered her mouth and smiled. Now I believe that Wang Fei said concentrated fragrance pavilion exists to make money. But it's lively these days. When these people leave. Yili smiled and said, Don't worry. This time, many people came and won't leave. In the future, more people will come. This will require concentrated fragrance pavilion's efforts to tell those rich people the benefits of living and doing business in Ruyang City. Yaoji understands. Yaoji walked to the window and curiously followed Yili's gaze. What is Wang Fei looking at? Yili pointed at the arena not far across the street and asked, What's going on there? Yaoji smiled and said, Setting up an arena. These days, not only are there many merchants coming to Ruyang, there are also many young masters and martial artists. That arena has been set up for 2 days, but the champion seems to be from the northern tribes. If you win, the prize is a treasured knife studded with gems. 50 taels of silver once. These 2 days, the champion has earned a lot of money. Compared to a treasured knife studded with gems, 50 taels of silver was naturally nothing. But if no one could win, then the champion didn't need to pay any cost. 50 taels of silver was enough for a normal person to live for 2 to 3 years. Yili was curious, what arena is so difficult? Yaoji said, Archery. Archery? Yili raised her eyebrows in surprise. It seemed that the champion of the northern tribes was very confident in his archery skills. One had to know, what kind of place was Ruyang now? It was where the Mahist army was stationed. Half of the Mahist army's elite Black Cloud cavalry were stationed outside Ruyang City. And all of the Black Cloud cavalry could be said to be 1 in 100 master archers. Yaoji looked outside and suddenly smiled. Wang Fei, are those the young generals of the Mahist army? Yili looked outside and saw that a few young generals had squeezed to the front of the crowd. It was Yun Ting and the young general called Qin Yun who had fought with Yili in the Mahist army camp. It seemed that the two had a good relationship now. Yili stood up and smiled. Let's go and see what's so special about the northern tribe's master archers. Chapter 463. Yaoji smiled, since that is the case, I will join in the fun. Princess, please. The arena was placed on the street opposite the concentrated fragrance court. Yili walked over and saw a dagger embedded with gems in the middle of the arena from afar. If the opponent did not have great confidence in his archery skills, then he must be rich and have no place to spend it. Let's not talk about the dagger, just the hilt and the scabbard were embedded with rubies, sapphires and emeralds. Just the gems on the scabbard were priceless. Qin Feng. Yili said softly. Qin Feng, who was following behind her, came forward and said softly, Princess, what are your orders? Yili looked at the middle-aged man in the northern tribe's uniform and said, investigate this person's background. Qin Feng looked at the man on the arena and nodded, yes, Princess. The 3 of them stood at the back of the crowd. Yun Ting had already jumped onto the arena and looked arrogantly at the northern tribesman. Tell me, how do we fight in this arena? The northern tribesman sized up Yun Ting and laughed, this young master is so fair and clean. Do you want to fight in the arena? Don't be unable to draw your bow. Our northern tribe's bow cannot be compared to your Dechu states. Yun Ting laughed coldly and said, if I don't want to fight, then why am I here? To fight with you. Walking to the place where the bows and arrows were placed, he casually picked up a bow and an arrow. With a backhand, he shot an arrow towards a thick pillar at the side of the ring. With a zing sound, the arrow nailed into the pillar and sank into the wood. The spectators below the stage cheered loudly. The northern tribesman also clapped and laughed. Good, I did not expect this young master to be an expert. Since that is the case, let's begin. Yunting snorted and looked down at the bow in his hand, ignoring the other party. The northern tribesman did not mind and laughed. The rules are simple. This humble one has heard that there is a saying in the Central Plains called sharpshooter from 100 paces. We, the northern tribes, do not like those elegant things. Forget about shooting a willow leaf from 100 paces away. Young master, please look over there. Following the direction of his finger, there was a towering tree about 70 to 80 steps away from the arena. At this moment, there were countless threads hanging down from the numbers on the tree, and at the end of each thread was a copper coin. It was already night time. Even though the streets were lit up like daytime, it was still not as bright as daytime. If one didn't look carefully, they wouldn't even be able to see the strings that held the coins. The copper coins swayed in the cool breeze, occasionally producing a crisp sound. The man said, "There are a total of 30 copper coins on it. As long as young master shoots all of them down, this saber will be young master's. You only have half an incense's time, 10 arrows." In other words, he had to use 10 arrows to shoot down 30 copper coins. Yunting. Chen Yun frowned. In terms of archery, he was not inferior to Yunting, but to him, it was impossible to shoot down 30 copper coins with 10 arrows. These copper coins were hung at different heights, and it was easy to imagine how difficult it would be to shoot down a few of them at the same time. Compared to the so-called shooting a willow leaf from 100 steps away, this was much more difficult. Yunting stared at the tree for a while, then snorted and shot an arrow. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, the arrow left the bowstring and shot towards the copper coins under the shade of the tree. With a few crisp sounds, one of the copper coins was pierced through the middle. The huge force of the arrow caused the copper coin to shatter into pieces and fall to the ground. The arrow did not stop there, and shot through another thread that held the copper coin before piercing into the tree. Good! The spectators below the stage could not help but cheer. To be able to shoot two in such a dark night, his archery skills were definitely not inferior to the so-called shooting a willow leaf from 100 steps away. The man from the northern tribe standing on the stage did not show any surprise. Yunting and Chen Yun on the stage did not say anything. Those who knew archery understood that the further one shot, the harder it was to shoot. Yunting's archery skills were not bad, but he might not be able to shoot all 30 copper coins. Seeing Yunting knocked his arrow and aimed again, everyone's eyes were fixed on the copper coins under the tree. When Yunting shot his 7th arrow, there were still 15 copper coins left on the tree. Qin Feng silently appeared behind Yili, giving Yili a shock. Yili turned her head to look at Qin Feng. Qin Feng said in a low voice, "This middle-aged man is indeed from the northern tribes, but he is not an ordinary one. He is a capable general under Helianjin of the northern tribes. He is also known as the #1 archer of the northern tribes. Furthermore, the dao that he is using as a prize is not simple. It was given to him by the king of the northern tribes when Helianjin was still favored. It is said that it can cut through hair with a single blow and is incomparably sharp." Oh? Yili raised her eyebrows and said with a smile, "The #1 archer of the northern tribes has come to Ruyang to set up a stall?" Qin Feng smiled and said, "Him setting up a stall has nothing to do with the king of the northern tribes. Ever since Helianjin fell out of favor with the king of the northern tribes, although there were a few factions that wanted to rope him in, they were all rejected by him. He even gave up his original position in the army. Therefore, he is now just a commoner. As long as he does not violate the laws of the various countries, no one can control where he sets up his stall." Because the crown prince had just been born, when Ruyang City sent out invitations, it had already announced that people from all over the world were welcome to come to the northwest for business or sightseeing. Therefore, these days there were many martial arts experts, Jianghu tourists, and even scholars and poets who set up a competition. Of course, there were even more merchants and tourists who came after hearing the news. Yi turned her head to look at him and asked with a smile, "So he is one of Yelu Ye's men?" Qin Feng nodded and said, "You can say that." Yi laughed coldly, "What a good Yelu Yi, and also the seventh prince of the northern tribes." Yelu Yi clearly knew that Ruyang was where the Mahist army and Black Cloud cavalry were stationed, but he still sent someone to cause trouble. Didn't he just want people to know that the archery skills of the Mahist army and Black Cloud cavalry were only so-so? Seeing Yi become angry, Qin Feng asked in a low voice, "Wang Fei, how many people should this subordinate send to deal with him?" Even Qilin did not have many people who could achieve such a demanding archery skill, but fortunately, it was not impossible. Right now, among the hundreds of Qilin, there could be 7 or 8 who would accept the challenge. But in his previous life, there might not be anyone in the northern tribes who had the strength of this person in front of him. Otherwise, how could he be the number 1 archer of the northern tribes? Yi shook her head, indifferently saying, "This kind of trash doesn't need a Qilin to make a move. Maybe Yelu Yi just wants to meet a Qilin." How could a Qilin be someone that anyone could meet whenever they wanted to? The so-called special forces, no matter what era it was, were synonymous with mystery. If everyone could guess their battle strength, then what was the point of being a secret trump card? "I'm afraid that Officer Yun is going to lose." Qin Feng pointed at Yun Ting, who was preparing to shoot the last arrow. There were still 13 copper coins hanging on the tree. Yun Ting would not be able to shoot all of them down in one shot. Yi smiled lightly, "It's a good thing for young people to have some spirit. Losing to the number 1 archer of the northern tribes, he is not wronged." Qin Feng nodded, "Wang Fei is right." When Yun Ting's last arrow left the bowstring, he actually shot out 3 copper coins at once. Even so, it was clear that Yun Ting had lost this round. The young handsome face was as cold as ice, and there was a trace of depression that was hard to detect. The man from the northern tribes smiled, "This young master, you have lost 50 taels." Yun Ting's face darkened as he took out a 50 taels silver ingot and handed it to the man from the northern tribes. Then he turned and jumped off the stage. Chapter 464. Is there any other expert willing to come up on stage and try? The man put away the ingot and smiled at the audience. Even the Mahist army cannot do it, who else can win? Someone in the crowd shouted. Instantly, everyone's eyes focused on Yun Ting. The man on stage smiled and said, "Oh? So this little brother is a soldier of the Mahist army? Sorry for the disrespect. I heard that the Mahist army is made up of 1 in 100 master archers. Is there any other Mahist army soldier willing to come up on stage and try? How about this young master?" He looked down at Qin Yun, who was beside Yun Ting. His voice had a hint of provocation. Qin Yun and Yun Ting's archery skills could be said to be equal. At this time, they could neither go up nor stay down. Yun Ting's face darkened. He knew that his pride had implicated Qin Yun. Just as he was about to go up and speak, Qin Yun reached out and pulled him back. Qin Yun thought about it and was about to speak when he heard an elegant voice from behind, "Since it is like this, can this consort try? General Huyen of the northern tribes?" Everyone was stunned. They were all focused on Yun Ting's archery, and because it was night time, Yi and Yaoji were standing in an inconspicuous position at the back. Everyone in front of the ring did not notice that there were 2 beautiful women in the crowd. Hearing Yi Li's words, everyone turned to look at Yi Li. There was even a portion of people looking at the northern tribes people on stage. It was understandable that the northern tribes people had enmity towards the Dechu state. So no one took the provocation of Qin Yun to heart. But if it was the famous general of the northern tribes, the number 1 master archer of the northern tribes, provoking a nameless Mahist army general, then it was not acceptable. Greetings to Princess. Half of the people in front of the arena were residents of Ruyang City. When they saw Yi Li, they hurriedly stepped forward to salute her and made way for her. The others naturally followed suit. Although they were not under the command of the Mahist army and the Prince Ding mansion, they were guests and had to show some respect to the host. With his identity exposed, the northern tribes man was stunned. He looked at the lady in green who walked out from the crowd. She was beautiful and elegant, with a smile on her face. She looked like a lady from a prestigious family in Dechu State. However, that smile made him feel a chill down his spine. She smiled at Yili, so it's Princess Ding. This one doesn't quite understand what Princess Consort is talking about, General Huyen. Yili smiled faintly and leapt onto the stage under the watchful eyes of the crowd. She said lightly, the former #1 archer of the northern tribes, Huyen LV. Although some of the children under this consort's command aren't worth much, for a general to personally instruct them is too much of a waste of talent. When this consort returns, this consort will definitely thank the crown prince of the northern tribes. What she meant was that Huyen LV had been famous for a long time, yet he had challenged 2 young generals of the Mahist army in public. He was clearly bullying the weak. Yili smiled as she looked at Huyen LV. Her calm eyes held a faint coldness. Did Huyen LV think that after leaving the northern tribes for so many years, no one would recognize him? Even if others did not recognize him, the crown prince of the northern tribes would recognize him. Huyen LV was shocked. He forced a smile and said, since Princess Consort wants to fight, this one naturally welcomes you. Princess Consort, please. He planned to use his identity as an excuse. Yili did not care. She tilted her head and looked at the gem-studded dagger in the center of the arena. She smiled and said, the gift from the king of the northern tribes must not be ordinary. Then this consort will not be polite. Huyen LV's face darkened. He said, let's wait for Princess Consort to win. He retreated to the side and handed the bow and arrow to Yili. Huyen LV did not make things difficult for Yili with the bow and arrow. He was not an idiot. If he took out a bow that even a burly man would find difficult to draw in front of everyone, it would be thought that he was bullying Princess Ding because she was a girl. Thus, it was better to choose a suitable bow to defeat himself. Huyen LV had absolute confidence in his archery skills. He naturally did not believe that the graceful and weak woman in front of him was a godly archer with 100 hits. He had heard of the story of how Princess Ding had scared Princess Lingyun to tears with a single arrow. But in his view, the Princess Ding of that time could barely even shoot an arrow. Yili calmly took the bow and arrow from Huyen LV and tested it. She smiled faintly and said, good bow. Huyen LV proudly said, the bows of my northern tribes are naturally good. A few dozen steps away, there were already new copper coins hanging from the tree. Huyen LV said, Wang Fei can walk closer before shooting. Yili smiled faintly and said, many thanks for General Huyen's good intentions. If it was someone else, they might have accepted Huyen LV's good intentions. But Yili knew that when it came to archery, the closer you were, the better. For example, in the current situation, if you were to stand directly under the tree, even if you were a godly archer, you would not be able to shoot down all the copper coins. Under everyone's gaze, Yili calmly reached out and picked up 3 arrows. She placed them on her shoulder and drew the bow. Everyone sucked in a breath. Princess Ding was actually planning to shoot 3 arrows at the same time. They saw Yili skillfully draw the bow. She slightly moved her position and then let go without hesitation. They heard the arrows fly through the air. Under the lantern light, 3 silver lights shot out towards the distant tree. Then they heard the crisp sound of copper coins falling to the ground. Yili's hands did not stop. She did not even look to see how many of the first 3 arrows had hit. She once again picked up 3 arrows and drew the bowstring. She shot, there was a crisp sound. Before anyone could react, Yili had already drawn the bow again. This time, she really did turn her body. She squatted on the ground and shot 3 arrows from the bottom up. In the blink of an eye, only one of the 10 arrows was left. Everyone looked down at the tree. There were still 5 copper coins hanging on the tree. Many people were already secretly worried for Yili. But no matter who won or lost this battle, no one would doubt the archery skills of the Mahist army. Not far away, in a side room of the concentrated fragrance pavilion, there was an open window facing the arena below. 2 men sat facing each other. Looking at the arena below, their expressions were complicated. Li Wang, what do you think? Princess Ding's last arrow was? Mo Jingli raised his head and drank the wine in his cup. He coldly said, what does Yi Li's victory or defeat have to do with I? The reputation of the Mahist army does not belong to I. That howling moon blade also does not belong to I. Hearing this, Yi could not help but shake his head and sigh. Prince Ding is really lucky. If he could have such a woman as his wife, it would be the greatest blessing in the world. Bang! Mo Jingli heavily slammed the wine cup in his hand on the table. The wine jug and plates on the table shook. Yi smiled as he looked at Mo Jingli's gloomy expression. He smiled and said, speaking of which, Princess Ding was originally the fiancée appointed by the late Emperor of Dechu State to Li Wang. What a pity, Kacha. The wine cup in Mo Jingli's hand shattered, leaving only fragments in his hand. In the other room, Lei Tingfeng and Genom of Gojoseon were also paying attention to the arena. Lei Tingfeng smiled and praised, I did not expect Princess Ding to improve so quickly. I remember that 2 years ago, Princess Ding was not even familiar with drawing a bow. Father, who do you think will win? Genom of Gojoseon did not seem to hear. He only focused on the azure-clothed woman on the arena. His eyes flashed with a strange light. Lei Tingfeng did not say anything. He quietly lowered his eyes. No one knew what he was thinking. Chapter 465. On the stage, Hu Yanlu stared at the green-clothed woman in front of him as he tried to hide the shock in his heart. Princess Ding, this is the last arrow. Yi Li smiled and calmly took the arrow. This time, she was not in a hurry. Instead, she slowly knocked the arrow and took aim. Everyone could not help but hold their breaths as they looked at the few remaining copper plates on the tree. They saw Yi Li suddenly leap forward. She stopped on the table behind her and jumped up. While in the air, she quickly drew the bow and shot an arrow. Whoosh, the arrow was nailed into the tree. Everyone stared blankly at the empty tree in front of them. The copper plates hanging from the tree had disappeared without a trace. Those with sharp eyes could see that there were a few strings of the same length hanging from the tree. Princess Ding's last arrow had actually broken a thin thread. How could this kind of archery skills and eyesight not shock people? Yi Li turned to look at the pale Hu Yanlu and smiled faintly. The same rules. If General Hu Yan can stand aside, then this consort will lose. The crowd was in an uproar. Previously, it was Hu Yanlu who had set up the stage to challenge everyone. Now, the situation was reversed. Princess Ding was challenging Hu Yanlu, the #1 expert of the northern tribes. The crowd below the stage was discussing. Yun Ting, who had a cold face, was now very excited. How is it, General Hu Yan? Don't tell me you don't dare to accept our consort's challenge. Hu Yanlu's face was ashen. He did not dare. Hu Yanlu was known as the #1 expert of the northern tribes. He naturally had real skills. If he had more time, he might have been able to do what Yi Li had just done. But now, he was powerless. He could shoot 1 arrow at a time and guarantee that he could shoot down all the copper coins within 10 arrows. But he could not control 3 arrows to shoot down 7 or 8 copper coins at the same time. And Yi Li clearly knew this. That was why she had given him such a difficult problem. General Hu Yan. Yi Li reminded with a smile. This one concedes. Hu Yanlu gritted his teeth and said. When he raised his head, he was immediately booed. Yi Li walked to the center of the ring and picked up the gem-studded dagger that was placed on the shelf and pulled it out. A gust of cold air immediately rushed out. The bright blade was so shiny that it could reflect one's reflection. The sharp and cold blade showed that this blade had drunk countless amounts of blood. Yi Li casually waved her hand, and the table in front of her immediately shattered. Yi Li returned the saber to its scabbard and praised, "It really is a good saber. Many thanks to General Hu Yan." Seeing Yi Li put away the treasured saber in her sleeve, Hu Yanlu's complexion turned ashen, but he had nothing to say. He could only look on helplessly as Yi Li walked down the stage with the treasured saber that he was so proud of. Yi Li took the Howling Moon's saber and jumped down the stage. Yun Ting immediately rushed up and greedily said, "Princess, can this subordinate take a look at the treasured saber that you won?" That was a famous treasured saber of the northern tribes. There were many swordsmiths in Dechu State, and there were many famous treasured swords. But the craftsmanship of the saber was not as good as that of the Western Tomb and the northern tribes. Especially since the northern tribes were good at using sabers. The sabers that they made were all top quality, not to mention the famous Howling Moon saber. Yi Li glanced at him with a smile that was not a smile. Yun Ting suddenly remembered the trouble that he had caused before. The excitement on his face immediately turned to depression and fear. After appreciating his depressed appearance, Yi Li smiled and threw the treasured saber into his hands. Yun Ting hurriedly thanked her. He held the arrow in his hand and studied it carefully. His fondness for it was evident in his words. "Your Highness's archery is truly marvelous." "This subordinate is extremely impressed," Qinyun said sincerely as he followed beside Yi Li. Ever since the martial arts competition last year, Qinyun had been full of admiration for this young Wang Fei. After today's scene, it was even more convincing. Yi Li smiled and said, "How is it as mysterious as you say it is?" "I just put in a little more effort than usual. On the battlefield, there is no need for everyone to shoot copper coins from trees in the middle of the night. You are killing enemies on the battlefield, not performing in the arena." Qinyun smiled but did not speak. He understood that the princess was comforting him. He only decided that when he returned, he would work even harder to practice his archery skills. Qinyun and Yun Ting lived in the military camp and were not going the same way as Yi Li. When they parted, Yun Ting could only reluctantly return the treasured saber to Yi Li. Looking at his eager appearance, Yi Li smiled faintly and threw the saber back into his hands, saying, "If you like it, then take it." "Ah!" Yun Ting stilled and was overjoyed. At the side, Qinyun helplessly rolled his eyes at him. With his pitiful and reluctant appearance, those who did not know would think that the one that Wang Fei was taking away was not a saber but his beloved. He knew that Wang Fei was very tolerant of the people around her, so he did not stop Yun Ting from being foolish. When Yun Ting reacted, he carefully held the saber and asked in a daze, "Wang Fei is really giving it to me?" Yi Li smiled and said, "I didn't come for his saber. It was just a coincidence. Even more, there is no one in Wang Fei who likes to use this kind of saber. Since you like it so much, you can keep it." Compared to this kind of curved sword, Yi Li preferred light and straight daggers and military knives. Even more, the beautiful gems and decorations on the scabbard were not suitable to be carried around as a weapon. When Yi Li gave an affirmative reply, Yun Ting stupidly held the saber. He looked as though he wanted to put the saber in his mouth and take a bite to see if it was real. Qinyun, who was standing beside him, couldn't help but secretly take a step back, embarrassed to walk with him. Yi Li looked at Qinyun and said with a smile, "Ben Fei remembers that Field Officer Qin uses a spear and needs a close combat weapon to protect yourself. I just recently received a cold rhino blade. Later, I will have someone send it to you to see if it suits you." Qinyun was overjoyed. The scabbard of the cold rhino blade was not as beautiful as the Howling Moon in Yun Ting's hands, but the blade was not any worse. Because they had been forged by the same master. And it was more practical than the Howling Moon blade. Because the Howling Moon had been obtained by the royal house of the northern tribes, it had been decorated so beautifully that it was not suitable for the battlefield. The cold rhino blade had always maintained the original simplicity and sharpness of the blacksmith. "This subordinate thanks Wang Fei." Yi Li waved her hand and said with a smile, "No need. It is a good thing that a good weapon can find a good owner. Ben Fei will go first. It is rare for me to have some free time. You guys can play. Farewell Wang Fei." The place where Yi Li and the others were speaking was only a dozen steps away from the stage. Yi Li's careless action of tossing the Howling Moon saber to Yun Ting was naturally seen by many people. The common people naturally thought that Princess Ding treated her subordinates well and was benevolent. But the people involved all had dark expressions. In Ningxiang Pavilion, Yelu Yi and Mo Jingli both stared at the graceful figure walking away amidst the crowd. A trace of gloom and anger flashed across Yelu Ye's eyes. Yi Li had exposed Hu Yanlu's true identity in front of everyone. But after winning the Howling Moon Blade, she had carelessly given it to a lowly military officer. This was clearly looking down on the royal house of the northern tribes and him, Yelu Yi. Yi Lu Yi, who had always been arrogant, was once again rebuffed by Yi Li. How could he swallow this anger? Yelu Yi stood up and wanted to jump down from the window to chase after the figure that was gradually blending into the crowd. But he suddenly felt a cold gaze shoot towards him with undisguised killing intent. Following the direction of his gaze, he saw a man with snow-white hair staring at him with a cold expression through an open window on the opposite street corner. Yelu Ye's heart jumped. He suppressed the chill in his heart and slowly sat down. Mo Xiaoyao watched him sit back down. His lips hooked in a cold smile as he raised the wine cup in his hand. Yelu Yi gave a cold snort. He raised the wine cup in front of him and drained it in one gulp. Chapter 466. Princess Ding is indeed a unique woman, this prince admires you. In a quiet room, the crown prince of the northern tribes, Yelu Hong, looked at Mo Xiaoyao and smiled. Just now, everyone's attention was focused on the arena below, and did not notice that the crown prince of the northern tribes and Prince Ding were watching from a room on the second floor. Mo Xiaoyao snorted, but his cold face had a bit of warmth. Obviously, he was very satisfied with Yelu Hong's compliment. Princess Ronghua sat next to Yelu Hong. She used to be the proud and beautiful princess of the royal family in the capital, but now in the northern tribes, she was even more gentle and charming. Princess Ronghua gently leaned against Yelu Hong, and poured wine for him from time to time. Her beautiful eyes were slightly narrowed, but there was a bit of bitterness and complexity. Just 2 years ago, she hadn't put Ding Wangfei in her eyes at all. But in just 2 years, the gap between her and Princess Ding had become so big that she felt ashamed to even be mentioned in the same breath. Looking at Princess Ding's calm demeanor on the arena and her archery skills that even the best archer of the northern tribes could not match, Princess Ronghua knew that Princess Ding was someone she would never be able to match in her life. The door of the room was gently pushed open from the outside. Yi Li stood at the door with a smile and said, "Crown Prince Yelu, I'm sorry to disturb you." Yelu Hong was startled, but quickly smiled and said, "How would I dare? This prince is honored to have princess here. Please come in." Yi Li stepped into the room and walked to Mo Xiaoyao's side. Mo Xiaoyao reached out to help her sit down, and said softly, "Just find someone to play with him." Why did Princess Li personally compete with him? Yi Li smiled and said, "I just wanted to see how good the #1 archer of the northern tribes is." Yelu Hong raised his cup and smiled, "I've embarrassed myself in front of Princess." Although Hu Yanlu was known as the #1 archer of the northern tribes, that was only a matter of more than 10 years ago. The current Hu Yanlu. Yelu Hong shook his head and smiled, "Let's not talk about such a disappointing person. Come, Princess, Prince, please." Yi Li raised her wine cup and said with a faint smile, "Crown Prince, Crown Princess, please." A few days before Prince Ding's 1-month-old birthday party, the entire Ruyang city was filled with singing and dancing. Behind all this singing and dancing, there were also some agreements that had been reached in secret. For example, trading with Nanzhao and purchasing large amounts of medicinal herbs from Nanzhao every year. Another example would be secretly purchasing large amounts of grain from a grain merchant in Dechu State. Or the temporary agreement with the crown prince of the northern tribes to stabilize the borders was carried out without the knowledge of the public. As a result, compared to the joyous and peaceful people outside, the people inside the Prince Ding mansion were busier than usual. Reporting to Princess Genom of Gojoseon and Crown Prince Genom of Gojoseon request an audience. Yi Li had a rare moment of free time to accompany the baby in her room. The baby, who was almost a month old, was not as sleepy as when he was just born. He opened his round eyes and looked at Yi Li. His dark eyes seemed to be covered with a layer of water, causing Yi Li's heart to soften. She felt that no matter how much she loved this baby, it would not be enough. Hearing Lin Han's report, Yili frowned and asked, "Is the prince in the mansion?" Lin Han said, "The prince accompanied young Master Qingchen out of the city this morning and has not returned yet. Would you like to invite Genom of Gojoseon to come back tomorrow?" Everyone in the Prince Ding mansion did not have a good impression of Genom of Gojoseon. Zhuo Jing, Lin Han and the others were still brooding over the incident of Princess Fei falling off the cliff. Naturally, they did not wish for Yili to see Genom of Gojoseon again. Yili put down Imo Xiaobao and said with a faint smile, "No need. Right now, we are in the Prince Ding mansion. If Ben Fei refuses to see you, it will seem cowardly." Lin Han was silent and retreated to the door to wait for Yili to come out. Not long after, Yili had already settled Imo Xiaobao down. She led Qing Luan and the others out of the room and towards the front hall. In the main hall of the Prince Ding mansion, Lei Tingfeng sat calmly below Genom of Gojoseon and looked at the furnishings of the main hall. To be fair, the Prince Ding mansion in Ruyang was not as magnificent as the Prince Ding mansion in Chujing. Because it was newly renovated, it did not even have the ancient and gloomy atmosphere of the Ding mansion in Chujing. Instead, it had more of the rough simplicity and freedom of the Northwest. Genom of Gojoseon was also looking at the entire main hall, but his gaze was more focused on the direction of the door. Hearing the tinkling sound of ornaments outside the door, Genom of Gojoseon's eyes became deeper and sharper. Yili stepped into the main hall and laughed loudly. Ben Fei came late and made Prince and Shitzi wait for a long time. "Director Imo, why didn't you serve tea to the guests?" Lin Han, who was beside Yili, glanced at Genom of Gojoseon and his son, who were sitting empty, and said lightly, replying to Princess, "Director Imo went to arrange for people to decorate Mr. Qingyun's new residence." Lei Tingfeng also knew that he and his son were not welcomed in the Prince Ding mansion. He smiled bitterly in his heart and said to Yili, "Princess, you don't have to be polite." Yili smiled sweetly and said, "Etiquette can't be ignored. Recently, the mansion has been very busy. Director Imo is inevitably negligent. Shitzi, please forgive me." Lin Han nodded and went to the door to instruct the servant girl who was waiting outside to serve tea. When the tea was served, Yili took a sip of tea before looking at Genom of Gojoseon and said with a smile, "My son's 1-month-old banquet is approaching. Today, this consort and the prince are both busy. If there is any neglect, please don't blame the prince." Genom of Gojoseon looked deeply at Yili for a long time before moving his eyes away and said with a smile, "How could that be? Princess's arrangements are very thorough. I only feel at home." Yili naturally didn't take Genom of Gojoseon's polite words seriously. She didn't ask about the arrangements for the guests at all. Zhuo Jing and Wei Lin were both vengeful people. They probably wouldn't really make the guests they arranged feel at home. After pausing for a moment, Yili asked, "Prince and Shitzi, why have you come?" Lei Tingfeng smiled and said, "There are some small matters that I would like to discuss with Prince Ding. However, this humble prince has asked to see Prince Ding twice before and has been rejected. I have no choice but to come and disturb Princess. I hope Princess will forgive me." Yili blinked. She thought about how Imo Xiaoyao's face would darken at the mention of Shilin and Genom of Gojoseon. If Lei Tingfeng asked to see him, he might really be rejected. Most of the time, Imo Xiaoyao was completely unreasonable when he was willful. However, Yili wasn't displeased at all. She knew that Imo Xiaoyao was so willful and rude to the people of Shilin not only because of the current conflict between the Northwest and Shilin, but also because of her. It was common for countries to fight to the death. After the fight, they would continue to drink at the table as if the friendship between the two countries had a long history. This was because there were no permanent enemies or friends between countries. Instead, it was personal matters that made it easier for people to bear grudges. Looking at Lei Tingfeng with a smile, Yili smiled unapologetically and said, "Xiaoyao has been busy these days. Shitzi, please forgive me." Lei Tingfeng naturally couldn't not forgive her. He waited until Yili asked, "If Shitzi has anything to say, it's the same to tell me." At this time, Lei Tingfeng glanced at his father who was sitting to the side thinking about something. He smiled and said, "Actually, it's not a big matter." This humble prince accidentally heard that Prince Ding has reached a trade agreement with the Northern Army and Southern Zhao. Yi Li raised her eyebrows. The word "accidentally" was used well. Xiling must have placed many spies in each country to be able to have such an accident. She calmly waited for Lei Tingfeng to finish his words. Lei Tingfeng felt somewhat helpless. He really didn't like to talk to Yi Li. This was because after interacting with Yi Li a few times, it was difficult to treat her as an ordinary person. No matter when, it was difficult to see any unexpected emotions in her eyes or face. It was as if she was really a gentle and harmless lady from a famous family. One could never see any emotions such as curiosity, surprise, or worry on her face. The pressure such a person gave to the opponent during negotiations was unimaginable because one could never find out her bottom line. Perhaps her bottom line was only a few millimeters away from yours, but it felt like it was thousands of miles away. Chapter 467. It was not the first time Lei Tingfeng had been so depressed. After a moment of disgust, he did not care. He continued, "Wang Fei should know that there are many transactions and exchanges between our country, Dongchu, and Nanzhao every year. Many of these goods need to pass through the northwest." While Xiling was large, it was a country lacking in material resources. Many things had to be imported from other countries. Of course, Xiling pursued the principle of being strong if you could rob, but there were always some things that could not be robbed. For example, the silk, satin, tea, and porcelain that the Emperor of Xiling loved had to be bought from Nanzhao and the Dechu state. These things were not available in the small countries of the West. In the end, the people of Xiling and the people of Dechu state were of the same origin, so most of the people of Xiling were more used to the products of Dechu state. The northwest was the communication stronghold between Dechu state and Xiling. If these things wanted to be transported back to Xiling, they had to pass through the northwest. As for the roads in the southwest, it had been said since ancient times that the Shu road was as difficult as ascending to heaven. It was already very difficult to enter Shu, and they had to travel through mountains and rivers to send the caravans back to Xiling. Not to mention the long detours, the dangers and bandits on the road were enough to make most merchants retreat. Yi Li smiled. Lei Tingfeng had only said one sentence, and she understood the purpose of their visit today. In reality, the Prince Ding mansion had been waiting for their arrival. But Yi Li had not expected that it was not the people of Xiling who wanted to raise their status to buy time, but Mo Xiaoyao who had refused to let them in. Gently putting the teacup back on the table, Yi Li leaned back in her chair and looked at Lei Tingfeng. She asked, "I understand Shizi's meaning. Originally, opening up the roads and allowing trade between the two countries is a good thing. But, what benefits does this have to the northwest? In short, why would the Mahist army allow the Xiling caravans to pass through?" Lei Tingfeng's eyes darkened slightly. He smiled and said, "Even during wartime, the two countries do not restrict caravans. Mutual exchange has always been a consensus between our country, Dongchu, Northern Army, and Nanzhao." Wang Fei's words make me puzzled. Yi Li looked down and smiled faintly. "Since that's the case, the West Hill caravan can go through the northwest. Why does the heir have to specifically ask this consort?" Lei Tingfeng choked on his bet. When the so-called consensus was implemented, most of the time, it was just a piece of waste paper. The trade route was long and eventful. Bandits might appear at any time. Who could say for sure whether it was an accident or not? At least in the past year, especially in the past half a year, the number of traveling merchants from Xiling to Dechu state was even fewer than during the war. Nowadays, the prices of many things in the Emperor of Xiling's city were still very high. He only heard Yi Li say unhurriedly, "Shizi said that traveling merchants are not allowed during wartime, but this consort expresses her doubts. If the two countries were at war, they would naturally want to kill each other. At that time, would the Dechu state still agree to sell silk and grain to the West Hill? Would he still agree to Nanzhao's medicinal herbs being transported from Dechu state to West Hill? Besides, even if none of this matters, How would Shitzi distinguish whether the merchants that came during wartime were real merchants or spies? Lei Tingfeng paused for a moment and then sighed helplessly. He looked at Genom of Gojoseon, who had been sitting quietly and listening to them talk. Genom of Gojoseon finally raised his head and stared at Yi Li. He asked, "What conditions does Princess Ding want?" Yi Li smiled slightly and waved her hand at Lin Han behind her. Lin Han neatly took out 2 booklets and gave one to Genom of Gojoseon and Lei Tingfeng. Genom of Gojoseon took it and looked suspiciously at Yi Li before lowering his head to open it. A moment later, he raised his head and asked, "According to what Wang Fei says, what benefits does West Hill have?" Yi Li smiled faintly and said, "Since the Northwest can accommodate trade with the countries of the 4 seas, naturally West Hill cannot be treated differently. Genom of Gojoseon and Shitzi's conditions will naturally be resolved, right?" Genom of Gojoseon frowned and said in a low voice, "I need time to consider." Yi Li smiled and said, "Of course. Prince and Shitzi can answer before they leave Ruyang." Genom of Gojoseon put away the booklet and stood to look at Yi Li. He said, "Wang Fei really does not intend to consider I's original proposal. If Wang Fei is willing to come to West Hill, I will treat you with the courtesy of Prime Minister." Yi Li was startled and couldn't help but laugh. Just as she was about to answer, she heard Imo Shoyao's cold voice from outside the door. "Thank you for Genom of Gojoseon's kindness. I's beloved concubine does not need the position of Prime Minister of West Hill. Moreover, who does not know that the position of Prime Minister is just an empty title in West Hill?" Imo Shoyao stepped into the hall with a cold aura. He looked disdainfully at Genom of Gojoseon in front of him and did not hide the killing intent in his cold eyes. The original position of Prime Minister of West Hill was not an empty title. No matter which country it was, the position of Prime Minister was definitely important and even superior to tens of thousands of people. However, when it came to Genom of Gojoseon's generation, there was a change. The original Prime Minister of West Hill was loyal to the previous Emperor of Xiling and was naturally loyal to the current Emperor of Xiling. In the early years, he had made trouble for Genom of Gojoseon. However, even though the Emperor of Xiling was not as wise as Genom of Gojoseon, he still knew that the Prime Minister was one of his own. He defended him in court, and for many years, Genom of Gojoseon did not have a good time. It was only in recent years that the old Prime Minister, who had been through 2 dynasties, was exhausted to death. The subsequent Prime Ministers were just puppets and could not make any decisions. Now that Genom of Gojoseon said that he would treat Yi Li with the courtesy of the Prime Minister, it was naturally very interesting to those who knew the truth. Su Qingchen followed behind Imo Shoyao and entered. When he saw Genom of Gojoseon and Lei Tingfeng, he only raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at Yi Li with a smile. Yi Li smiled helplessly and waved for someone to serve tea to Imo Shoyao and Su Qingchen. Lei Tingfeng looked at Su Qingchen for a moment and smiled, "Young Master Qingchen, long time no see. You are even more elegant than before." Su Qingchen smiled leisurely, as if he did not have the slightest trace of smoke. "Your Highness is joking. It hasn't been that long. Didn't we meet in the south last year?" Lei Tingfeng's eyes darkened slightly and smiled, "This one remembered wrongly. Last year in the south, Su Qingchen had caused him no small amount of trouble." Lei Tingfeng naturally would not underestimate this seemingly free and unrestrained young man who had been crowned as the world's #1 young master by the people of Dechu State. While this side was peaceful, the other side was not so polite. Imo Shoyao casually sat next to Yi Li and leaned against the back of the chair. He lazily looked at Genom of Gojoseon and asked, "Genom of Gojoseon has graced us with your presence. What brings you here?" Yi Li softly explained the purpose of Genom of Gojoseon's visit. Everyone in the hall listened and waited for Imo Shoyao's reply. In the end, Imo Shoyao still had the final say in the Prince Ding mansion in the northwest. If he did not agree, then it would be a waste of time to say anything else. Imo Shoyao's cold face revealed a trace of a cold smile. He looked at Genom of Gojoseon and smiled. "Didn't Genom of Gojoseon say that he wanted to compare notes with I? It just so happens that I have some free time today. As long as Genom of Gojoseon defeats I, anything can be discussed." Everyone was stunned. They did not expect that Mo Xiaoyao would want to fight with Genom of Gojosian at this time. Lei Tingfeng frowned and said, "Prince Ding, now." Mo Xiaoyao interrupted Lei Tingfeng and said with a smile, "Don't worry, heir, I will definitely not bully Genom of Gojosian because he is missing a hand. At worst, I will also fight with Genom of Gojosian with one hand." Chapter 468. Hearing this, the hall was filled with a chill. Genom of Gojosian stared darkly at Mo Xiaoyao and said coldly, "Prince Ding is too conceited. Do you think you have the ability to fight with I with one hand?" Everyone knew that Genom of Gojosian's left arm was a taboo. That was also the worst defeat in Genom of Gojosian's life. Not only was his undefeated record broken, his personal guards were almost completely wiped out before they managed to save him. Even so, he still paid the price of an arm to escape from Mo Liufang's hands. Now that the person who mocked him was Mo Liufang's son, it was even more unbearable. Mo Xiaoyao didn't care about Genom of Gojosian's anger, and said casually, "It's still easier than waiting for Genom of Gojosian to grow a new arm, right?" Impudent. Genom of Gojosian was furious. His right hand slammed heavily on the armrest, and he leapt into the air, sending a palm strike towards Mo Xiaoyao. Mo Xiaoyao snorted, and with a wave of his sleeves, he grabbed Yili with one hand and dodged Genom of Gojosian's attack. When Genom of Gojosian and the others chased after them, Mo Xiaoyao had already landed on the ground with Yili in his arms. He even had the time to comb her hair that was blown by the wind. Then, he turned to face Genom of Gojosian and took 2 steps forward, saying indifferently, "Please." Genom of Gojosian snorted coldly, and flew towards Mo Xiaoyao. Mo Xiaoyao didn't avoid him either, and the two of them began to fight in the courtyard outside the hall. This action naturally attracted the attention of many people in the Prince Ding mansion. Everyone who heard the news stared at the fight between Genom of Gojosian and Lei Tingfeng, who was watching from the side. Feng Zhiyao was even more anxious to see the world in chaos. He stood beside Yili and said with a grin, "Wang Fei, has our prince's martial arts improved yet again? Prince Ding has single-handedly challenged the #1 master of West Hill. Once this news spreads, I don't know how many people will bow down to the name of our prince." The people present were all people with sharp ears and eyes, so they naturally heard Feng Zhiyao's words clearly. When he looked again, Prince Ding had indeed only used one hand when he was fighting with Genom of Gojosian. His other hand was behind his back and did not move at all. Genom of Gojosian naturally heard this as well. His expression became even more gloomy, and his moves became even more fierce. Even though it seemed fair to use one hand to fight with the other, there were not that many fools in this world. Genom of Gojosian had been crippled for more than 10 years, so he was already used to using one hand. Prince Ding, on the other hand, had always used 2 hands. Now that he was using only one hand, his combat power was definitely not as good as before. In this way, Genom of Gojosian would look bad if he lost, but it would also be dishonorable if he won. Even though the Prince Ding mansion had strict rules, the people who had free time were still quite relaxed. For example, at this moment, the people who had nothing to do to watch the fight between their prince and Genom of Gojosian had already started to bet on who would win and who would lose. However, the results of the bets were somewhat distorted. They were all betting that their prince would win. In this way, if they lost, they would not have to pay, but if they won, they would not have to pay, so the bets could not be opened. Feng Zhiyao smiled from ear to ear as he approached Lei Tingfeng and said, "Prince Lei, do you want to place a bet? Do you think our prince will win, or your family's king of axes?" Lei Tingfeng glanced at him indifferently. Naturally, he would not answer such a question. Feng Zhiyao did not mind his indifference. He turned and asked Yili, "Princess consort, what do you think?" Yili was focused on the fight in front of her, and did not have the mind to pay attention to Feng Zhiyao's words. Speaking of which, this was the first time she had seen the real fight between the world's top 4 masters. The others were also watching seriously. After all, such a fight was not common. For those who practiced martial arts, watching such a battle between experts was also very beneficial to their own martial arts cultivation. The only person present who was not interested was Su Qingchen. Even though young Master Qingchen was a genius, he did not know anything about martial arts. With his cultivation and knowledge, he naturally had no interest in watching the spectacle. Looking at the mesmerized crowd in the courtyard, young Master Qingchen could only helplessly leave quietly and return to his study to deal with his own matters. This fight lasted for nearly 4 hours, and the original bet quickly spread from the Prince Ding mansion to the entire Ruyang city. Han Mingxi, who had heard the news, rushed over to be the banker. He had people continuously broadcast the results of the fight to the outside world, and at the same time, set a new betting record. The citizens of Ruyang City naturally supported their prince without any hesitation. However, those who supported Genom of Gojoseon did not say anything. Although the number of people who supported Prince Ding was not as many as those who placed their bets on him, the number of people who placed their bets was not a problem. Therefore, for a moment, the two of them appeared to be evenly matched. In the courtyard of the Prince Ding mansion, the two figures exchanged blows at lightning speed. Their speed was so fast that it was almost impossible to see their moves clearly. After the two palms met again, the two of them retreated a few steps back. Genom of Gojoseon's expression was hidden. His originally gorgeous sleeves had been shredded by the fierce wind from the palms, making them look ragged. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes slightly. His face was slightly pale, and a strand of snow-white hair fell in front of his face. It was obvious that it had been cut off by the wind from the palms. Genom of Gojoseon laughed coldly and said, Mo Xiaoyao, do you really think that you can use knife with one hand? Mo Xiaoyao raised his head and smiled faintly. Why don't you try and see if I can cut off your other hand as well? Impudent brat! Genom of Gojoseon angrily rebuked. He waved his palm, and the force of his palm surged towards Mo Xiaoyao with the force of a landslide. Mo Xiaoyao's body turned, and like a spiral, he leapt up and turned in the air at a strange angle, directly aiming for Genom of Gojoseon's right arm. Father, be careful! Lei Tingfeng cried out in alarm. Genom of Gojoseon snorted coldly. His palms did not stop, and he quickly sent out a few palms to stop Mo Xiaoyao's attack. The two of them once again fought back and forth. Yili did not see the end of this competition. As she watched the sun set in the west, Yili got up and returned to her room to take care of her precious son. In any case, in the Prince Ding mansion, even if Mo Xiaoyao could not win against Genom of Gojoseon would definitely not be able to hurt him. When she returned to her room, Mo Xiaobao was indeed fine. He was crying loudly in his wet nurse's arms. Because Yili did not like wet nurses to take care of children, Mo Xiaobao did not like to be carried by wet nurses other than when he was drinking milk. Even the two madams of the Su family were more liked by Mo Xiaobao than wet nurses. When Yili returned to her room, the two wet nurses were being tormented by Mo Xiaobao until they were covered in sweat. She walked over and took him into her arms. Mo Xiaobao's large eyes looked at his mother. He sniffled and rubbed his little nose in Yili's arms before falling asleep. Yili looked at the little bun in her arms with interest. She did not know if such a small thing could recognize people, but it was clear that the little baby could recognize her and Mo Xiaoyao. This proved that no matter how much Mo Xiaobao cried, as long as he was in her arms, he would definitely not cry again. Similarly, no matter how happy he was, as long as he was awake, he would definitely cry until the sky turned dark in Mo Xiaoyao's hands. Yili could not help but wonder where this 1-month-old little guy got so much strength and tears. Just as she was coaxing Mo Xiaobao to sleep, the servant outside reported that first Madame Su, second Madame Su, and young Miss Qin had arrived. Yili hurriedly had someone invite the three of them in. Eldest aunt, second aunt, older sister Zheng, why are you here? Why are you here? Yili carried Xiaobao out and asked with a smile. Chapter 469. Su Defuren smiled. I heard that there was a fight in the front yard. Although the Su family was not pedantic, but women generally did not go to the front yard, especially now that Qin Zheng was preparing for marriage and the two Su Furens also had to prepare for the wedding. Yi Li smiled and said, "Aunt, you don't have to worry. His Royal Highness and Shilin Zhennan Wang are just playing around." Even as women, they had heard of Genom of Gojoseon's reputation. How could they not be worried? So they sat in the parlor and chatted with Yi Li while waiting for news. Only when the sky was completely dark did Qing Luan run back and smile, reporting to Wang Fei, "The fight in the front yard is over." Yi Li raised her eyebrows and smiled, "Who won?" Qing Luan grabbed the end of her braid and said with some confusion, "It seems that no one won and no one lost, it was a draw." But in the end, Genom of Gojoseon spat out blood. Probably Genom of Gojoseon lost. Neither lost nor won. Then clearly won. If it was a draw, then the house would win. Qing Luan covered her mouth and smiled. "Maybe, when I came back just now, I saw young Master Han smiling very happily. Prince said that after sending off Genom of Gojoseon and Shitzi, he would come back to have dinner with Wang Fei." Yi Li nodded and smiled. "Let the kitchen prepare a few dishes that Prince likes." Qing Luan smiled and left. Knowing that there was nothing else, the two Su Furens and Qin Jing also got up and left. After a while, Mo Xiaoyao had already returned. Seeing Yi Li holding Mo Xiaobao, who refused to sleep, in one hand and holding a book in the other to pass the time, he frowned unhappily. Hearing the footsteps, Yi Li quickly put down the book and smiled. "You're back. Are you hurt?" Mo Xiaoyao snorted softly. He picked up the swaddling blanket that was wrapped in little treasure Mo and walked towards the bed. Yi Li was shocked. It was scary enough for a 1-month-old baby to be carried in swaddling clothes. Seeing Mo Xiaoyao put the baby back into the cradle, Yi Li let out a sigh of relief. Mo Xiaobao didn't cry and even looked at her with his big round eyes. She was just about to ask Mo Xiaoyao about Mo Xiaobao's safety when the baby she gave birth to would be tortured to death by his own father. Before Yi Li could say anything, Mo Xiaoyao let out a muffled groan and sat down on the bed. A trace of blood flowed from the corner of his lips. Yi Li was shocked and frightened. How could she still remember to blame Mo Xiaoyao as a father? She hurriedly got up and asked someone to call Shenyang over. Mo Xiaoyao reached out to grab her and shook his head. Yi Li frowned and looked at him for a while. Other than his face being a bit pale, there was nothing wrong with him. Only then did she relax a bit. She wiped the blood from the corner of his lips and asked, "Why didn't you say that you had internal injuries? Didn't you say that it was a draw and Genom of Gojoseon vomited blood?" Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly. "Lei Zhenting is one of the top 4 masters in the world. How can there be no price to pay when fighting with him?" Yi Li looked at him unhappily and said, "So, Genom of Gojoseon vomited blood in front of others, but Prince came back and vomited blood behind others' backs?" Mo Xiaoyao snorted and looked at Yi Li without refuting. Of course, he couldn't tell Yi Li that Lei Zhenting didn't intend to vomit blood, but he was angered by him in the end. So Lei Zhenting didn't vomit blood because he was injured, but because he was angered. Mo Xiaoyao couldn't help but frown when he thought of Lei Zhenting's last palm strike. The #1 master of the West Hill was indeed worthy of his reputation. If they were to compare moves to his full strength, he might be able to beat Lei Zhenting because of his uninjured hands. But if they were to compare internal energy, he seemed to be slightly inferior. But it didn't matter. He wasn't even 30 years old, but Lei Zhenting was already close to 50 years old. If he could still beat Lei Zhenting in terms of ability, then Lei Zhenting's title as the #1 master of the West Hill wouldn't be so genuine. Even if they didn't use their internal energy, he could still kill him. Whenever he thought of the way that old man looked at Yi Li, Mo Xiaoyao couldn't control the murderous intent in his eyes. Mo Xiaoyao suddenly felt that his last words to Lei Zhenting were too tactful. That old and ugly man's face didn't even deserve to look at Yi Li. Thinking of something, Mo Xiaoyao thoughtfully raised his hand to touch the mask on his face. Yi Li looked strangely at the man who was sitting by the bed in a daze. She raised her hand to touch his forehead and asked, "What's wrong? Are your injuries too serious?" "It's nothing." Mo Xiaoyao smiled and said, "I'm just thinking about tomorrow's banquet." I don't know if Lei Jinting will be able to attend. Yi Li sat down beside him and said with a smile, what's there to think about? The so-called banquet is just a formality. The truly important matters were dealt with before and after the banquet. The full moon banquet was just a show for ordinary people. As for whether Genom of Gojoseon could attend, Mo Xiaoyao wouldn't be so reckless as to beat Genom of Gojoseon until he couldn't get out of bed, right? On this day, Ruyang City was once again in an uproar. Although most people didn't see the duel between Genom of Gojoseon and Prince Sting, there wasn't a single person in Ruyang City who didn't know about it. So much so that after the duel ended, no matter which side they supported, they all hung their heads in dejection and secretly felt sorry for their wallets. Only the banker, Han Mingxi's extraordinarily handsome face smiled more and more seductively. Who told Prince Sting to personally admit that he had tied with Genom of Gojoseon? No one won. In the end, the winner was naturally Han Mingxi. Located not far from the Prince Sting mansion, the Han estate was Han Mingxi's residence in Ruyang City. At this time, Han Mingyue was facing a table full of banknotes, silver ingots, jade, jewelry, and so on with a smile. Feng Zhiyao sat to the side and cast a sidelong glance at the overjoyed Han Mingyue and snorted in displeasure. Han Mingxi raised his head and glanced at him. He got up and walked to his side, sat down, and said with a smile, "Young Master Feng San, how come you have time to come to my humble home?" Feng Zhiyao glanced at the things on the table that he hadn't had time to put away and asked, "How much did you earn?" Han Mingxi raised his eyebrows and proudly gestured a number. Feng Zhiyao was immediately envious and jealous. He fiercely glared at Han Mingxi, 50,000 taels. That included his own 800 taels. Han Mingxi contemptuously glanced at him and said with a smile, "Young Master Feng San, aren't you looking down on Prince Sting and Genom of Gojoseon too much? What is 50,000 taels? 500,000 taels." Feng Zhiyao was immediately stunned. His original envy and jealousy immediately turned into deep hatred. He looked at Han Mingxi as if he was looking at a tall mountain of gold. More importantly, that mountain of gold belonged to someone else. No wonder so many people in this world like to open casinos. It was simply a matter of small capital and huge profits. No, Han Mingxi didn't even need the capital. It was simply a matter of no capital and huge profits. Han Mingxi sighed with some regret. It's a pity that Prince Sting and Genom of Gojoseon both agreed to have a duel in private. If there was a duel or something, it would have been announced to the entire Dechu state or Xiling 2 months in advance. Then, not to mention 500,000 taels, he might even have gotten 5 million taels. Losing such a huge opportunity to make money made Han Mingxi's heart ache. Perhaps the members of the Han family were born with a talent for making money. Over the past year, Han Mingxi felt that he could gradually understand his elder brother's personality when he was dying for money. Feng Zhiyao glared at him with dissatisfaction for a long time before saying casually, "Prince wants you to give him the money as soon as possible." Hearing this, Han Mingxi was furious. He stared at Feng Zhiyao with a vigilant expression and said, "Why should I? This is the money I earned myself." Feng Zhiyao sneered, "Don't be silly. If Prince hadn't admitted to a draw in front of everyone in the end, do you think you could have won? Prince said that he would only take half of your money." Seeing how Genom of Gojoseon vomited blood on the spot, if Prince insisted that he had won, no one would have been able to object. When this matter was brought up, Han Mingxi's anger subsided. He asked curiously, what did Prince Sting say to Genom of Gojoseon in the end? Although his martial arts weren't very good, he still had some knowledge. Originally, Genom of Gojoseon hadn't been injured much after the last palm strike. At least, he hadn't vomited blood on the spot. After Prince Sting said something to Genom of Gojoseon's ear, he saw a mouthful of blood spurt out from Genom of Gojoseon's mouth. It was clearly because he was angry. Chapter 470. Feng Zhiyao said lazily, "How would I know? Give me the money, I don't have time to count money with you." "So, you're here to ask me for money on behalf of Prince Sting?" Han Mingxi said hatefully. If he had known this was his intention, he would have sent someone to chase him out when he entered the door. Feng Xiao raised his eyebrows and laughed. What's the problem? Otherwise, I'll tell everyone in the Mahist army that you and Prince Sting were secretly colluding to control the outcome of the battle. The Mahist army didn't dare to cause trouble for Prince Sting, but they could definitely trample Han Mingxi to death. Thinking of those martial artists who had lost money and were full of resentment, Han Mingxi was angry, but he didn't dare to say anything. He angrily took out 250,000 taels from the table and gave it to Feng Xiao. After putting away the money, Feng Xiao stood up and bid farewell with satisfaction. Prince Sting had agreed to return his 800 taels to him. He wasn't greedy, as long as he didn't lose money. Inside the Han residence, while Han Mingxi was complaining about the large decrease in his income, Mo Xiaoyao was sitting in his study. When he saw the banknotes that Feng Xiao brought to him, a satisfied smile appeared on his face. Feng Xiao looked at him in confusion and asked, Han Mingxi's 250,000 taels, as well as the rest of the bets in the city, adds up to 400,000 taels. Ah Yao, what do you need so much money for? Most importantly, Prince Sting couldn't find money anywhere. Why did he need to use this method to earn money? Mo Xiaoyao looked at him leisurely and said, who placed the most bets? Feng Xiao smiled and said, do you still need to ask? Of course it's the envoys and nobles from various countries. No matter how many commoners there are in Ruyang City, how many of them can there be? I secretly asked around. Mo Jingli bet a total of 50,000 taels that Genom of Gojoseon would win. Well. Princess Anxi also bet 30,000 taels, but she bet on you, Prince. These were the people who were not on bad terms with the Mahist army. As for the West Hill people and the northern tribes, such as the 7th Prince, wouldn't they bet on Genom of Gojoseon? Even if it was just for the sake of vindication, they wanted to overwhelm the Prince Sting mansion in terms of momentum. Unfortunately, they did not know that in the end, it was Prince who killed them all. Mo Xiaoyao said, then what about the money for Xiaobao's 1-month-old celebration? Don't tell me the Prince Sting mansion is going to pay for it. Feng Xiao was speechless. Shouldn't the Prince Sting mansion's crown prince's 1-month-old birthday party be hosted by the Prince Sting mansion? Prince, there should be a limit to how stingy you can be, okay? Mo Xiaoyao didn't care about his subordinates' silent curses. Why would he use his own money to entertain those idiots that he didn't like? He waved his hand and said, go, transfer the money directly to Zhou Yu. Isn't he in charge of all these things? If there's any money left, just treat it as a red packet to the people in the city. Feng Xiao silently admired him in his heart. Prince, not only did you beat up Genom of Gojoseon to vent your anger, but you also earned back the money needed to host the little crown prince's 1-month-old birthday party. How could you use the leftover money to buy people's hearts? Compared to you, Han Mingxi's ability to earn money was simply trash. The entire Ruyang city was in an uproar for nearly half a month. Prince Sting's 1-month-old birthday party was finally held as scheduled. In fact, the so-called banquets, whether it was a 1-month-old birthday party, a wedding party, or even a coronation party, were all the same. The only difference was the size of the party. The banquet this time was the same as the previous one. It was still held on the tower in the east of Ruyang City. When Mo Xiaoyao held Yi Li's hand and walked up to the main seat on the tower, everyone couldn't help but be stunned on the spot. Mo Xiaoyao, who always wore a silver half-mask, finally took off the mask that had accompanied him for nearly 10 years. However, what was exposed in front of everyone's eyes was not the hideous scars and face that they had originally expected. Under the candlelight, silvery white hair casually draped behind his back. Only a silver ribbon casually tied up the hair. Under the cover of a few strands of silver hair was Mo Xiaoyao's handsome and upright face. The people sitting below couldn't even see a small wound, let alone a hideous scar. What was displayed in front of everyone was clearly a somewhat pale but absolutely handsome man. At this moment, the handsome man present was naturally not good. However, only the white-clothed young master Qingchen, Su Qingchen, could be compared with the unreachable white-haired man who was dressed in a dark purple noble robe on the high platform. However, young Master Qingchen's expression was indifferent. His white robe made him look like a celestial being who had descended, as clear as a lotus and as quiet as the moon. However, the white-haired man was like the sharpest sword, the most noble and gorgeous jewel, the coldest and most icy snow at the peak of a mountain. Even his smile seemed to carry a frightening chill and pressure. As expected of Prince Ding. With such elegance, who else in the world but Princess Ding is a match for him? Even though her heart was tied to Su Qingchen, Princess Anqi couldn't help but sigh as she looked at Mo Xiaoyao. Hearing this, Mo Xiaoyao raised his head and looked at Yi Li, who was standing side by side with Mo Xiaoyao. He smiled faintly, his eyes filled with gratification. When Li had been betrothed to Mo Xiaoyao, the Su family had felt guilty. If Li's marriage to Prince Ding was due to King Li's abandonment, the Su family had at least half of it. Now that they saw Prince Ding standing side by side with Li, the Su family was naturally overjoyed. Princess Anqi's words are reasonable. I've long heard that King Ding's consort is outstanding. She truly lives up to her reputation. On the other side, the crown prince of the northern tribes, Yelu Hong, added. He raised his head and looked at Yi Li with admiration. Yi Li was naturally a beautiful woman, but her appearance couldn't be considered devastatingly beautiful. What was truly attractive was the aura and expression she exuded. Standing beside Mo Xiaoyao, even the most beautiful woman in the world would be reduced to a foil. However, Yi Li wouldn't. She stood calmly beside Mo Xiaoyao, a gentle and elegant smile on her lips. Her beautiful and tranquil face, coupled with her distant and calm eyes, was like a peerless peony quietly blooming. Who said that peonies had to be grand and magnificent? She was beautiful, dignified, and natural. She was clearly the king of flowers. Greetings to Prince Ding and Princess Ding. Everyone, please rise. Mo Xiaoyao held Yi Li's hand and said with a smile, "Thank you for not being willing to travel thousands of miles to attend my son's one-month-old celebration. I and the princess consort hope that tonight, the guests and hosts will be courteous and not return until everyone is drunk. Prince Ding, since tonight is the little heir's one-month-old celebration, would we have the honor of seeing the little heir?" Someone immediately asked. Although they all knew that the little heir's one-month-old celebration was just a cover, since they were already here, they couldn't possibly not see the little heir's appearance, right? Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly. What's so difficult about that? The wet nurse carefully carried the infant onto the stage. Yi Li smiled as she took the child. Looking down, Yi Li saw that even though it was late, Mo Xiaobao still hadn't slept. His round and watery eyes looked at Yi Li. It was unknown if he could really recognize Yi Li or if he was familiar with her scent, but once he was in Yi Li's arms, he immediately giggled. Yi Li lifted him up slightly so that the people below could see Mo Xiaobao's appearance. The little guy wasn't afraid of strangers and obediently laid in Yi Li's arms, looking at the people below with his large eyes. He didn't care at all that he couldn't see the people and things below. The little crown prince is really talented and full of spirit. Everyone praised him. Yelu Yi, who was seated below, laughed loudly and said, "Prince Ding, I wonder if the little heir has received his name." Chapter 471. Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and said, "Naturally. Mr. Qingyun personally bestowed the name to my son. Yu Chen Chen. Mo Yu Chen." In fact, many of the people present had already learned of Mo Xiaobao's name through various channels. But when it came from Mo Xiaoyao's mouth, it was a completely different concept. Nanzhao and Dechu states' culture and customs were completely different. They didn't feel much about it, only praising the good name. The northern tribes were barbarians beyond the Great Wall. Even if they learned from the Central Plains, it was still limited. The ones who were truly shocked were Genim of Gojoseon of Xiling and Mo Jingli of Dechu State. Yu Chen, such a name did not hide Mo Xiaoyao's expectations for this child or his own ambition. Mo Jingli looked up at Mo Xiaoyao, who was leisurely holding Yi Li and sitting on the high main seat. His heart surged. He had never understood what kind of mentality he had towards Mo Xiaoyao, but at this moment, he clearly understood how jealous he was of Mo Xiaoyao. Yes, it was jealousy. Even if they were on the same side, he didn't dare to openly give his child such a name. Therefore, Mo Xiaoyao's son was called Mo Yuchen, while his son could only be ranked in the royal family and be called Mo Yunxiao. Even if they were on the same team as Mo Jingqi, Mo Xiaoyao could openly invite the dignitaries of various countries, just like a king. But he could only secretly contact the dignitaries of various countries. In the eyes of the dignitaries of various countries, Prince Ding and Prince Li were never on the same level. Needless to say, the beautiful and elegant woman in Mo Xiaoyao's arms should have been his wife. However, even if his heart was filled with jealousy, he could only sit quietly below and watch Mo Xiaoyao's glory and pride. Sitting beside Mo Jingli, Yi Ying naturally saw Mo Jingli's expression. A mocking smile appeared on her lips. She looked up at Yi Li, but her eyes were filled with bitterness. In the past, she had felt incomparably proud that she had pulled Yi Li into the Li Palace. Occasionally, she would even feel a trace of sympathy for her half-sister who had joined the Prince Ding mansion. But now, they were both princesses. One of them sat above millions of people, controlled the huge Mahist army and the Prince Ding mansion, and had all the love and sincerity of the most excellent husband. She had been imprisoned in the capital with a sick and weak child. Now that she had finally escaped, her husband had many wives and concubines by his side. She had almost lost her place. Who was the one who needed sympathy? Mo Yuchen. Good name. Jinnan King's gaze lingered on the child in Yi Li's arms for a moment before he praised. Mo Xiaoyao was not polite and calmly replied, "It is a good name." Yelu Yi stood up and smiled, "Prince Ding's Shitzi is 1 month old. I specially brought a gift from the northern tribes for Shitzi. I hope Prince Ding will not dislike it." Mo Xiaoyao looked down at Yelu Yi and smiled faintly, "Seventh prince has come from afar. How can I be so rude? I thank seventh prince on behalf of my son." Yelu Yi smiled and raised his hand to blow a strange whistle in the air. With a whistling sound in the air, a black shadow rushed down from the air and headed straight for where Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li were sitting. The people below the stage could not help but exclaim. When the black shadow appeared under the light of the fire, it could be seen that it was not black, but a large snow-white bird. It spread its wings and a pair of sharp claws flashed under the light of the fire as it rushed towards the 3 people on the stage. In the midst of the crowd's exclamations, the large white bird seemed to have hit something and stopped a few feet away from the 2 people. Then it continued to charge forward. But there was clearly nothing in front of it, as if there was an invisible wall in front of it. At this time, the crowd could see that it was actually a large white eagle. The white eagle was blocked by an invisible barrier and could not get close to Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao. But it did not want to leave and instead desperately charged forward and cried out. Yi Li slightly frowned and reached out to cover Mo Xiaobao's ears. She coldly stared at the white eagle and said, "Shut up." The coldness was so strong that even the proud white eagle could not help but tremble. Then it cried out even louder. Mo Xiaoyao sneered. "Impudent." With a flick of his wide sleeves, even the valiant eagle was caught by him and thrown out. The direction it was thrown just happened to be where Yelu Yi was sitting. Seeing the white eagle being thrown without any resistance, Yelu Yi could only get up and quickly retreat a few steps. The white eagle just happened to land on Yelu Yi's empty chair. The dizzy white eagle couldn't tell the difference between a person and a person. As soon as it got up, it charged towards Yelu Yi. Yelu Yi was shocked. This white eagle was the most ferocious bird in the northern militant grassland. Even wolves were afraid of it. If one was scratched by its claws, even if they did not die, they would lose half their life. Yelu Yi hurriedly blew his whistle in an attempt to control the white eagle, but the white eagle had just been thrown to the ground by Mo Xiaoyao and was seeing stars. When it heard the whistle, it habitually rushed forward. Yelu Yi had no choice but to use his qinggong to retreat to the side. Thus everyone watched as Yelu Yi was chased around by the white eagle they sent over. They could only look at each other, not knowing whether to laugh or pretend they did not see anything. Mo Xiaoyao squinted his eyes to enjoy the farce in front of him. Yili held Mo Xiaobao and also indifferently looked at the little fellow who was occasionally reaching out to tease him. Mo Xiaoyao's roll and toss just now was not that simple. Yili was sitting beside him and clearly saw Mo Xiaoyao sprinkle some strange medicinal powder on the white eagle's body. Although she did not know what it was, she could make a guess based on the white eagle's behavior. The best part was that the white eagle was flying around. Even if they caught it later, they might not be able to find any medicinal powder on its body. More importantly, the white eagle was sent over by the northern militant people. Even if there was anything, it was their own business. Seeing Yelu Yi being chased around by the dizzy white eagle, Yili faintly smiled. "All right, come and take down the seventh prince's gift." "Yes, princess." Two shadow guards stepped out from the crowd and attacked the white eagle from the left and right. If the white eagle was flying in the air, they naturally would not be able to catch it. But the white eagle's body was heavy and could not fly. After a few rounds, the two worked together to capture the white eagle and lock it in a sturdy cage sent over by the people below. Only then did everyone let out a sigh of relief. Yelu Yi made such a big joke in front of the nobles of the various countries. Seeing the white eagle that was angrily banging against the cage and trying to escape being taken away, Yelu Yi's face darkened to a frightening degree. Everyone looked at his sorry state and whispered to each other. The people from the Prince Ding mansion had to restrain themselves out of respect for the host. The envoys from the other countries were not so reserved. A few people from Xiling were even convulsing with laughter. This made Yelu Yi's mood even more gloomy. Yili handed Mo Xiaobao over to the nanny beside her and said with a smile, "It was just a small accident, don't mind it. Prince Yelu, why don't you go change your clothes? You're tuning into the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.